The lady stood on the platform, and people surrounded her. They shouted that the Duke had shown disrespect to the Empress. They looked at the young lady with disdain and cursed the four great Ral's empires. The man looked at the lady with disdain and said that she even came to the execution to show off. The young lady tore her dress in anger. With lightning speed, she threw a piece of dress at the man, and he in turn screamed. She looked closely at the man and said that the dress with the amethyst hem was chosen especially for this day. She asked him with a smirk why he hated him so much, and a moment later, she left the man shouting angrily after hers. The young men also shouted that the girl's clothes were cursed and said that they should not be touched. The young lady looked up at the sky with a heavy sigh, wondering why she was destined to die like this. She knew she had done nothing wrong. She looked intently at the Duke of Cassius of the Valwis family. He was without an emotional devil who made everyone around him tremble with fear. She looked at the Duke intently as he was still her father, but unfortunately, she knew that they never managed to have a normal conversation. If she had helped him in his crimes, it would have been a just death. The young man looked intently at the young lady and called her Valicia Valwis, quietly awaited her verdict. A moment later, the young man called upon his power, and lightning flashed in the sky. She knew that the young man also did not have normal parents, but he managed to become an emperor in a foreign country. Peter de Raux, ruler of the Ral's empire, looked at the lady and said that this was the last time. He looked at her in surprise and asked if all Valwis were so emotionless. He sighed heavily and said that he would have liked to see at least a hint of regret in her eyes before she died. He came closer to her and quietly said that, after investigating, he found out that she had no connection with the Duke. He quietly said that her sentence could be changed if she would kneel before him right now. He said that she would still be executed, but it would not hurt as much. She looked at him intently and with a smirk told him to kill her already. The emperor looked at the young lady in surprise, but said nothing. Everyone present shouted that she was crazy. They were shocked and did not understand how she dared to speak so disrespectfully to the emperor. The emperor said that she seemed to him an example of a noble aristocrat, but upon examination, she turned out to be simply crazy. She looked at him intently and, sighing heavily, said that they were all equal in the face of death. She looked intently at the emperor and asked with a grin who could have thought that the pathetic servants would dare to bark at Valwis. The emperor looked at her intently and said that he would put an end to this. He said angrily that he would definitely put an end to her worthless life. A moment later, the young lady fell to her knees as she was already awaiting her execution. It seemed to her that this time would be the last. She was shocked because her body found itself in the spirit world again after waking up. She looked around slowly, as she always returned to this place after death. The spirit world is the place where the spirits of all the characters gathers. Having arrived in this place for the first time, she realized that she was nothing more than a hero in a pre-written story. People of this world, simple characters of the creator's play or story. She knew that all people were divided into main and secondary characters. The former can create their own history, but unfortunately the latter cannot do that. They could not act on their own accord. They could not deviate from the prescribed plot. And among them were those who lived this life over and over again, as if in a closed loop. They were called professional and secondary characters. The young lady, in turn, was the same. She lived the 99th life of a villain's daughter. Even though she had lived many lives, she was always relegated to the role of the villain's daughter. Perhaps that's why whenever she tried to do something good, everything went wrong. She said things she didn't mean to say. She acted in a way she didn't want to initially, and it all put pressure on her. Each new life seemed like torture to her. Moreover, she didn't even know the reasons. Her life simply didn't allow her to change anything. All the memories returned only at the moment when she came to the spirit world. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that the last life was the most difficult. Her father was so obsessed with the main character that he didn't find time to talk to his daughter. Because of this, there were rumors that the young lady had been abandoned. She thought that since she had grown up like that, it was true. She knew that if the Duke had not been obsessed with her, he would not have been executed. She in turn wondered if something like this would happen if there would be villains of villains. She sighed heavily as she knew that this would disrupt the course of history. She knew that only the main character could change the course of history. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that her new life was already beginning. She was very surprised as everything happened very quickly. She wondered if anything would change in the 100th interpretation. The young lady in turn really hoped that she would be lucky this time. She prayed very hard, because she didn't want to spend all her time alone again. The young lady, opening her eyes, froze in place as she saw that she was not a baby at all. She noticed that she had black hair just like last time. The maid looked at the little girl with disdain and asked why she was sitting on the floors. The maid shouted angrily the girls that if they give her food, then she needs to pay for it. The young lady in turn looked intently at the maid as she had seen her face somewhere before. She looked at the maid in surprise and called her by name. But a moment later, she received a slap. The young lady froze in shock. The maid looked at the girl with anger and asked if she had really eaten too much henbane. The maid angrily asked the girl who had allowed her to address her so carelessly. The young lady froze in shock as she realized it was the same maid. The lady was shocked and wondered why the maid from her past life was here. The maid was bullying her very much. She was in shock. She didn't understand why the person existed. She told herself that it was illogical. She began to look around in shock as she could not believe that she was in this place. She was in shock as she realized that she was now in the estate of Viscount Ilion. She had shaggy black hair and was wearing servant's clothes. She thought it was some kind of absurdity. She wondered if she had returned to her previous life. She asked the maid who she was. The maid looked at her with surprise and contempt. She told the girl that she was ready to pretend to be crazy just to avoid cleaning. She looked at the girl intently and called her by name. She asked if she had forgotten her own name. The lady wondered if she had actually gone back in time. Her childhood began with her and her mother in hiding, fearing the perverse obsession of her husband Cassius. Upon learning of her pregnancy, she fled the estate and begged the Viscount for help. Unfortunately, the Viscount's estate began to treat them even worse than commoners. The young lady was shocked as she returned to the time when she lived in this estate. She was surprised that she regressed, as she knew that only the main characters were capable of this. She knew she was still inside the story, even though she was a professional supporting character. A moment later, the Viscount approached them and asked what had happened. The maid said that she told the girl to wash the floor, but she disobeyed. The Viscount was surprised. The maid said that her training was not yet complete. The Viscount looked at the girl with fury and asked if it was true. He shouted that he took her in when she had nowhere to sleep. She was in shock that she only opened her eyes and saw him. The young lady stood frozen in place, wondering if she had actually gone back in time, and if this was the same regression. She understood that this was her chance to change her destiny, so to speak, God's grace. She pinched her cheek and screamed as she felt unbearable pain. The young lady was shocked as she realized that this was not a dream. The Viscount and the maid looked at the girl in surprise. The Viscount looked at the maid with a grin and asked if she shouldn't do something if a person doesn't obey. The maid looked intently at the master and said that the man needed to be reined in. The Viscount smiled and said that this was a correct judgment. The young lady froze in shock. The Viscount looked at the girl and told the maid to lock her in the disciplinary room, as if she understood that she would have to live without food and water again. She remembered the original plot in which her father came to the estate in search of her mother. She knew perfectly well that he was destined to die later, but she needed him right now. She looked at the Viscount with fury and asked if he knew who she was. He looked at her in surprise as he did not understand what she was talking about. She looked at the Viscount with fury and asked if he knew who her father was. She screamed and asked how they dared to treat her like a slave. She knew perfectly well that everything would collapse later, but now her family was one of the 4 great families, and she was the daughter of Valwis. She looked at those present with fury and shouted with all her might for them to call her father immediately. The maid was taken aback and asked for forgiveness. She froze in shock, not knowing what to do. The other maids, talking among themselves, wondered whether a noble guest had already arrived at their estate. The Viscount said with a grin that the law is not written for fools. He asked if she was really an aristocrat. She asked angrily how he dared to show disrespect to Valwis. He looked at her intently and asked with a grin if she was really a member of this family. A moment later, he pushed her, and she fell to the ground with a crash. He began to mock her as she fell from a light touch. He said with a grin that if she still wanted to be treated like an aristocrat, then he would arrange it. He looked at her intently and asked if she knew that nobles who ran away from their families were considered even lower than commoners. He said that her ladyship had no such right to be indignant. He told her with a grin not to even expect anyone to find her. He looked at her with fury and said that this would not happen. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Viscount with fury because she knew that she would soon be found. She knew that the Viscount would pay with his miserable life. He lifted the girl up in anger. The Viscount said that she was being fed and given a place to sleep. The Viscount, with lightning speed and fury, pushed her away from him and threw her to the ground, asking what else she wanted. He casually told the maid to send the girl to the disciplinary room. The maid asked which one exactly. The Viscount asked with a smirk, "What about the one where her mother was?" The young lady froze in shock on the spot. She knew that her mother had never been locked in the disciplinary room until she met her death. Sometime later, the young lady was brought into the room. A moment later, she was pushed carelessly and fell to the ground. Behind the closed door, she heard one of the men say that they would not feed her and that they would return in 5 days. The young man sighed heavily and said that the Valwis had been shaken to the core and that the Duke was now wreaking havoc in the empire. They knew that his wife and daughter were locked in the disciplinary room. The young lady turned around and froze in shock as she saw the body that was covered. She rushed to her mother in haste because she knew it was she. With trembling hands, she reached out to her. She pulled the blanket back a little and saw that it was actually her mother. The young lady burst into bitter tears over her mother's body. She was furious because they said that regression was God's grace, but she did not have time to save her mother. She cried and kept calling for her mother. She was in great pain because her mother was no longer in this world. She was in shock and didn't understand why she had to go through this again. A moment later, she heard some noise and froze in place. She turned around and asked who was in the room, for she was very scared. A moment later, lightning flashed outside the window, and she saw a boy standing in front of her. The young lady froze in shock when she saw the blonde hair. She was shocked because she realized that it was Peter, the main character, who killed her. She was shocked because she realized that they were now the same age. She said that it was simply impossible. She looked at the boy intently because she knew that he simply couldn't be here. Felicia looked at him intently and asked his name. The boy looked at her intently and said that his name was Cian. They stood there for a moment, looking at each other in complete silence, but he repeated again that his name was Cian. She froze in place, not understanding what was happening. A moment later, she called out and asked what color his eyes were. For a while, the boy stood and was simply silent. She was in shock and did not understand why he did not answer. She knew that in this case, she had to check it herself. She came closer to him and looked intently into his eyes while lifting his hair. She looked at him in surprise as he had black eyes. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand why they were black. A moment later, she apologized to him for touching him without permission. She knew Peter had golden eyes. She thought it might not be him, but a moment later, she stood there dumbfounded. Felicia, not knowing what was going on at all, she froze and wondered if she had just apologized. She came closer to him and asked if he was also locked in the room. She was shocked that she was worried about him and wondered if it was all because of going back in time. She knew that all her actions had been planned before she asked him if he had really angered the Viscount. Cian didn't answer. Her question, Felicia in turn, looked intently at the boy. A moment later, he sat down quietly on the floor as he did not want to talk to her. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what was happening. The young lady slowly walked closer to him. A moment later, she sat down next to him and said that she was locked in here. The young lady looked at the boy in surprise as he was trembling and crying. She came closer to him and asked what happened. She wanted to know if he was in any pain. He slowly raised his tear-stained eyes and said that it was not so. She looked at him intently and said that it didn't seem so bad. A moment later, his stomach rumbled and they froze looking at each other. The young lady looked at him in surprise and the boy hid as if he was ashamed. She asked with a smile if he was hungry. He said it wasn't so, but his stomach growled again. She said with a smile that his stomach was telling him he was hungry. Felicia looked at the young man with a smile and wondered if she should try to do something good. A moment later, she handed him a bun and said with a smile that he should consider himself lucky. She smiled and said that she was saving it for herself. She wanted to do the first good deed upon returning to the past. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't need it because he wouldn't be able to repay her. The young lady looked at him in surprise but did not answer. She was furious as this was the first time she had tried to be a good person. She asked him to take the bun as she was allergic and would not eat it. He looked at her hard and said that in that case, she could throw it away. She sighed heavily as she thought that being bad was not such a bad idea, since being good was very difficult. She pulled him towards her with lightning speed. The boy froze in shock looking at her. A moment later, she shoved the bun into his mouth with lightning speed. She looked at him intently and asked him what he would do after she shoved the bun into his mouth. She said he had no choice. He looked at her intently and told her not to ask him to repay her later. She looked at him closely as she saw that he had a good appetite. The young lady was surprised because he didn't really thank her. However, she felt amazing for the good deed. He came closer to her and asked if she could tell him her name. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily and stated her real name. The young lady looked closely at her mother and remembered how she hugged her and said nice things. She was puzzled because the only one who really needed her was this mother. The only one who looked at her with love and called her by name with warmth in her voice was her mother. The young lady in turn missed her mother very much. He looked at her intently and asked if this was her mother. She said that it was, and she fell into an eternal sleep. She looked at him intently and said that she didn't need pity. She said she was going to end this shitty life and start over. She knew that maybe things would go a little differently. Sometime later, she was sleeping quietly and peacefully next to her mother. The young lady woke up because she heard some noise she called her friend. She looked away in surprise and called her friend again, but did not see him. She was in shock, wondering if he had managed to escape. She looked into the distance in surprise, wondering how he could do that. But a moment later, there was an explosion. The young lady was in shock as she fell, and pieces of rock were flying at her. Some time later, she was already lying on the ground from a strong explosion. A few minutes later, she finally came to her senses and stood up trembling. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard a familiar voice. Looking up, she saw her father, Cassius Valwis, head of the ducal family. The duke approached his wife and asked her to wake up. He was in shock and screaming with tears in his eyes. He begged her to wake up. He froze in shock as he realized he had arrived too late. The young lady looked at her father intently. She was very scared. The duke in turn screamed with rage and tears in his eyes and asked who had done it. The young lady sat on the ground, taken aback, and did not know what to answer. A moment later, she looked closely at her father, who was looking at her with a fierce and cold gaze. He looked at her intently and asked again who killed his wife. She looked closely at her good old terrible father. She knew that this was the presentation of the main villain. The duke looked intently at the young girl. She froze in place as she saw his strength. She was in shock because he used his power on her, and she couldn't breathe. She understood perfectly well that her mother would not return, even if he took out all his anger on her. The duke looked at the girl with fury, but did not answer the commander of the king's raid. Aemon slowly approached the master and sent him away. The commander said that this child could not have done such a thing. The duke turned around and said that it did not matter. The commander was shocked as he looked closely at the young girl and realized that she was the master's daughter. The young lady was furious as everything was exactly as before, and her father did not recognize her. She understood perfectly well that the commander of the knights was the first person to guess her origin. The duke told the knights to search the estate. The young lady looked at her father intently and called him names in anger. He looked at her in surprise. She said angrily that he didn't know where her mother was. She asked him why he had only come now. She asked angrily why he was late if he had tried so hard to find her. He looked at her intently and said that he thought she was mute. The duke told the commander to search the estate first. The commander sighed heavily and told the master that this was not the main thing now. He looked closely at the gentleman and asked if the girl's hair and eyes didn't seem familiar to him. He looked intently at the gentleman and said that this child was his daughter. He asked the duke if he hadn't heard the girl call Vivian S. her mother. The duke froze in shock. For a moment, there was silence in the room, but a moment later, the duke ordered the commander to take the girl with him. He said they would do a relationship test later. The knight looked closely at the young lady and asked her to follow him. He looked at her in surprise, asked if she was okay, and if she wanted him to carry her. She refused. Some time later, they slowly left the estate. A moment later, the young lady walked leisurely past the knights of the Duchy. Some time later, they entered the room where the VisCount was. He was sitting on the floor, trembling with fear. The Duke looked at the Viscount with fury and called him. The Duke looked at the Viscount with fury and contempt and said that his wife was locked in the disciplinary room. The Viscount threw himself to the ground with lightning speed and told the Duke that there had been a misunderstanding. He said that the lady came to him herself and said that she wanted to stay at his estate. He said with puzzlement that she looked very confused then, and it was very difficult for him to recognize her as an aristocrat at that moment. He shouted that he could not know that the lady was his wife. Valicia in turn understood perfectly well that this was a lie. The Viscount shouted that he didn't even know about her origin and that he was not guilty of anything. The Duke listened to him and, looking at the Viscount with anger, asked if he really didn't know all this. He used his magic on the Viscount. The Duke said angrily that he did not even recognize the brooch she had given him as a pig's favor. He told the Viscount that he should have at least once asked him who this woman was. He said with fury that he had been looking for his wife everywhere. The Duke asked angrily if he really hadn't heard about it. The Viscount hesitated, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the young lady shouted that the Viscount had done it on purpose. She shouted that the Viscount was hostile to the Valwis family. She said that the Viscount didn't care about her sick mother. He also treated her like a slave. She knew that she could not forgive him for the death of her mother. She screamed that the Viscount even locked her and her mother in the disciplinary room. The Viscount was taken aback and told the Duke that this was not so, since the girl was only 5 years old, and she did not understand anything. The Duke looked closely at the little girl as he saw that she was dressed in an old servant's uniform. The Duke nudged the Viscount and said in a somber tone that their family returned exactly what they received. He looked closely at the girl and said that if she was one of them, she herself should choose the punishment for the Viscount. The young lady looked at her father in surprise, as she did not expect such a thing. The knight commander began to object. The Viscount, in turn, understood perfectly well that this was his chance. A moment later, he threw himself at the Duke's feet and shouted that he had committed a grave sin. He shouted that they could kill him. He said with a grin that if he had to accept her punishment instead, he would gladly do it. He knew that she was a child, and nothing would happen to him. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well what he was thinking about now, and she clearly saw him smiling. She slowly walked closer to him, because she knew that the time had come for retribution. She came closer to him and said with a smirk that of course he would get his punishment. She asked if they should start with the fingers first. He froze in place in surprise. He looked at the girl with surprise and bewilderment, as he wondered if she really wanted to cut off his fingers. She said her family had strengthened its influence by using magic in wars. She looked at the Viscount with a smile and a smirk, and said that she was from the Valwis family. She looked closely at the Viscount and said that their family was known for their sword skills. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she had already been through this twice, and he must accept his fate. She looked intently at the Viscount. He was very scared. A moment later, he threw himself at her feet and asked her to have mercy on him. Valicia was surprised as he began to address her respectfully. The young lady looked at him with fury and said that it was too late now. They would start with the fingers and gradually move towards the center. She said that there are also toes on the feet, and the little toe will go first. She looked at him intently and said that if they cut off his head right away, he would go to the next world. So it was better to do everything slowly, step by step. The knight captain looked closely at the girl and told the Duke that she was definitely his daughter. The Duke said that he would not be sure until she passed the test. The captain of the knights looked closely at the girl and, sighing heavily, said that he thought this should not be done. The Duke looked at her closely and said that her eyes were indeed somewhat similar to his. The captain told his master that the Viscountess and the rest of the servants had escaped through the back door. He looked at the gentleman and said that a child had been found in the warehouse where the Viscount was. He remembered how they found the child lying unconscious on the cold ground. He looked closely at the master and said that the child looked like a slave. The young lady froze in surprise as she looked at the boy. The Duke glanced sideways at the boy and told the captain that when he woke up, he needed to be questioned and then dealt with accordingly. The young lady was horrified. She wondered if they wanted to kill him. She knew he had done nothing wrong. She looked at her father hard and said that he shouldn't kill him. Valicia said that he did nothing wrong, and that he was just a child. The Duke looked intently at the young lady, but said nothing. A moment later, looking at the young lady, he asked if she was talking about him now. Valitia said that it was exactly so. He looked at her with a smirk and asked who said he was going to do something like that. The young lady looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect such a reaction. Some time later, they left in a carriage back to the duchy. Valitia looked intently at her father. She felt uneasy. He looked at her intently and said that he didn't even know her name. She looked at her father and said that her name was Valitia, but her mother called her Vili. He looked at the young lady and said that the gift she said she would give him, it was she. The young lady in turn looked intently at her father, but did not answer. Some time later, everyone in both duchies was whispering that the Duke was returning. They were surprised, because they heard that the Duke had a daughter. The maid, with a radiant smile, said that she was very interested to know who she was. The head maid looked at the maid intently and said that from now on, she would look after the young lady. She told the maid that she had a lot of work to do, so she should be attentive. Lisa said that she understood everything. A moment later, they reported that the Duke had arrived at the place. The Duke slowly got out of the carriage. He was carrying his wife. The maid was shocked because she realized that the Duchess had actually died. She couldn't believe she was so excited to be caring for a young lady under such dire circumstances. A moment later, she saw the young lady and froze looking at her. Lisa understood perfectly well that the young lady was having the hardest time right now. She understood that she had to try her best. The maid looked at the young lady and introduced herself with a smile, and also said that from now on she would serve her. She smiled and said that she would certainly take care of the young lady and do everything to make her happy. The young lady in turn looked at the maid in surprise, as she did not know that she could smile so well. She thought for a moment, as she knew that perhaps that was true, but her behavior had eradicated this trait from her. She angrily struck the maid and asked if she could not do that too. The young lady was furious and asked the maid if she was making fun of her. Lisa, in turn, asked the young lady for forgiveness, with tears in her eyes. Valitia D. thought that most likely at first, she was just as bright, and the office was not joyful. But as time went by, her smile faded more and more. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, as she knew that it was entirely her fault. The maid asked the young lady with a smile whether she would like to eat first, or whether she would like to take a bath first. Some time later, the young lady was taking a bath with her maid. Lisa froze in shock as she saw the scars on the young lady's back. Lisa understood perfectly well what the lady had to go through. She sat and cried quietly, while the lady pretended not to notice anything. Some time later, the young lady was glowing in her new outfit. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if there was anything she could not eat. She said she would pass the information on to the kitchen. The chef looked closely at the young lady and with a smile asked permission to present the dish. He smiled and said that they had prepared freshly caught fried fish. For meat dishes, he chose the largest animals that roamed the mountains and fields. He beamed as he said that he put his heart and soul into these dishes. She wondered if he had been like this to begin with. He looked at the young lady with a smile and said that it was time for her to enjoy the fine dishes. The young lady sighed heavily as everything was a hassle. But a moment later, she began to eat anyway. She silently asked them to stop staring at her so hard as she would soon have indigestion. The young lady looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that the dishes were simply a sight to behold. The chef in turn was amazed by such a reaction and beamed with happiness. He smiled and was once again convinced that his food was simply magnificent. Only before she had thrown out his dish for exactly the opposite reason. The young lady glanced sideways at the maids, wondering how long they would look at her. The maids looked at the young lady intently, because she was very cute, and her chubby cheeks were a stain. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and saw that she was uncomfortable in this situation. She looked intently at the maids, who in turn fell silent with lightning speed. A moment later, they left the kitchen, so as not to disturb the young lady. Valitia, in turn, was very glad that they left her. The maid looked intently at the young mistress and called her. She looked at the lady with a smile and said that this was her first time at her estate, so everything seemed strange and awkward to her. She smiled and said that tomorrow she would walk with her around the castle and tell her everything. Lisa said with a smile that the young lady would like the estate so much that she would not want to get married and would stay here for the rest of her life. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that this would not happen, since she was destined to die earlier anyway. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked if this was the first time she had met her father. The maid said that the young lady probably didn't know, but the Duke had not appeared at the estate since the Duchess left. Everyone said that there was no place where he would not look for her, not only in the Empire, but also in other countries. Lisa said that the Duke loved his wife very much, and he would adore the young lady too. She said with a smile that the Duke could become the biggest fool because of his daughter. The young lady, in turn, wanted to let go of this topic. She understood perfectly well that his obsession with his mother was the cause of their downfall. Lisa said with a smile that his lordship was like the main character in a love story. The young lady, in turn, knew that her maid had made 5 mistakes in the word villain. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she was happy because it also made her feel like the maid in the novel. She said she was really looking forward to seeing what kind of man the young lady would meet when she grew up. Valizia, in turn, did not want to upset the maid, but she was the daughter of a villain. The young lady knew that she was destined to die after meeting the novel's protagonist. Lisa, in turn, wondered what she should do, since she saw that it was very sad for the young lady to lose her mother overnight. She saw the dark expression on her face. She knew she needed to change the subject quickly. The maid was puzzled and didn't know what to talk about now. She knew that the young lady needed time to get used to the new place. She wanted to show that they were doing well here. The maid said with a smile that the young lady still didn't know much about the Duchy. She smiled and said that this place was beyond what she had previously imagined. She smiled and said that it looked like a fairy tale castle. The young lady was shocked by such a comparison. Lisa smiled and said that before she started working as a maid, she had heard a lot about the estate. She said she had heard many horror stories about maids who died while working for aristocrats. And at first, it had really bothered her. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that this was literally her dream job. She was glad that working hours were strictly regulated. She was also provided, like everyone else, with 3 delicious meals a day. The estate also had a recreation area exclusively for servants. There was also a vacation. The young lady looked closely at the maid. She did not want to upset her, as she knew that all this happened because the owner was absent from the estate. She knew that soon the life of a servant would slowly become miserable if she returned to her role. However, she knew that after returning to the past, she had managed to do a good deed which had never happened before. Valizia hoped that she would no longer live as the daughter of a villain, and that her dream of a good life would come true. The maid asked with a smile if the lady liked the story. She said that life in the estate was amazing. The young lady asked with a smile if her family was really like that. She said it was very different from what she had heard. She said with a smile on her face that she heard they were cutting up the bodies of disobedient servants. Lisa was in shock. She didn't understand who dared to tell her such terrible things. Lisa angrily shouted at the young lady not to listen to stories from these bastards, as nothing like that was happening. She said that the Valwis family, a family that became one of the 4 great families of the Empire, only because of its mastery of the ball. She said that the gentleman had been at the forefront of numerous wars and had contributed to the creation of the current empire. There was also magic that only direct descendants could use, and each had their own unique ability. Their family is in the overwhelming majority of cases stronger than the rest. Lisa told the young lady with a smile that she could be proud of her origins. Valitia looked closely at the maid as she saw that she was truly very devoted. She sighed heavily as she knew that the great family would soon fall. She knew that her father had completely neglected everything, and he was looking everywhere for a way to revive his wife. Among the people he met were those who said they knew how to bring her back to life. But soon their lies were exposed, and they themselves met their end. He looked at the young man with fury and shouted that he was a liar. He looked at the young man with fury and asked if he hadn't said earlier that he could revive her. He looked at the Duke intently and shouted that it was worth trying the divine power. Moral strength is a miraculous force that can heal any wound. The person who is widely known in the Empire for her is Empress Isilis the Saint. The young man said that he heard that the Empress was ready to extend a helping hand to those who needed healing regardless of status. He looked at the Duke intently and said that he should still go to her, and perhaps she would be able to bring the dead man back to life. The Duke looked at him intently and said that there was still a grain of truth in his words. The young man looked at the Duke puzzled. The Duke looked at him with fury and said that if this was his last will, Then it was not so bad the Duke dealt him a mortal blow. She knew that the more people he killed, the more he turned into a monster who felt no emotion. Some time later, he went to the imperial palace and asked the empress to bring his dead wife back to life. She looked at him intently and said that she was a saint, but she did not understand who could bring the dead back to life. She looked at the Duke intently and said that it was impossible even with her divine power. The empress sighed heavily and said that what had happened to the duchess was truly unfortunate, but he would still have to overcome it. He looked at her with fury and asked how she could talk about this when she hadn't even tried. The empress looked at the Duke with surprise and bewilderment. A moment later, everyone froze in shock as they saw the severed head. The empress looked at the Duke in surprise and asked what was happening. The Duke angrily told the empress that once a week she would receive one head from him. He said that this would continue until she brought his wife back to life. The empress sat in her room and sobbed. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard some noise. The Duke looked hard at the empress and said that she seemed to enjoy seeing good people's throats cut. Turning around, she froze in place as she saw the Duke. She looked at him intently and asked if she hadn't said she couldn't do what he asked. The empress shouted that healing a wound and resurrecting a person were two different things. The empress in turn shouted at the Duke that it was time for him to refuse. The Duke was in shock. He wondered if he should really give up his love. The Duke in turn looked at the empress with fury. She saw his menacing and angry gaze. He looked at her with fury and said that if she could not save his wife, then her false power was useless. The judge looked intently at the Duke and said that he had killed the empress and was himself sentenced to death. All his family's assets will be confiscated by the imperial family. All immediate relatives will also be sentenced to death. The maid looked intently at the young lady and wished her sweet dreams. The young lady looked at the maid with a smile and also wished her sweet dreams. The young lady in turn was a little alarmed, since now upon returning to the past, she could live differently. She wondered if the changes to the original plot were a benefit of regression. She was a little puzzled, because she didn't know if it was possible to reform the villain's father. She wanted to know if it was possible to reform a man who was so obsessed with resurrecting his wife that he went so far as to murder the ruler. The Duke looked closely at his wife. He could use his magic to keep her from disappearing. He was very puzzled and upset because he understood that he would never hear her beautiful voice again. He understood that he would no longer be able to see her beautiful and radiant smile. The Duke slowly leaned over the body of his wife and asked for forgiveness for coming to her late. He looked at his wife with tears in his eyes. He was in great pain because he couldn't protect her. He said that he was very sorry. The next day, the young lady and her maids walked around the estate and explored the area. The man looked out the window in surprise and saw a young lady walking. Duke of the House of Pell, Bluebell asked his assistant in surprise if the young lady should not be having a magic lesson now. He did not understand why she was playing in the yard now. The assistant looked closely at the Duke and said that the magic teacher had caught a cold and took a couple of days off. He said that it would be extremely terrible if the young lady caught it from the teacher. The Duke sighed heavily. He was a little puzzled and wondered if he could just laze around since he had no work to do. He had already said many times that if a person did not have the magical abilities of a Black Panther, then he needed to work 5 times harder. The assistant looked closely at his master and said that the young lady was still a very small child. The Duke sighed heavily and said that the young lady Valwis, with such a great bloodline, would soon be able to master magic without much effort. He looked sideways at his assistant and said that he could not drink it anymore. The man bowed to his master and said that he would immediately bring another drink. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, there was no news from the Viscount. He asked his assistant if he knew anything about it. The man said that a lot of time had passed since he received the last letter. He said that the Duke of Cassius might be involved in this incident. He sighed heavily and said that, after all, this is the Valwis family. Anything can be expected from them. He looked at his assistant with a smirk and said that they would simply watch as the Duke destroyed himself. He glanced sideways at his assistant and asked when the Duchess's funeral was. The man paused for a moment and thought. A moment later, he said that according to the report, there would be no funeral. The man looked at his assistant in surprise and asked what he meant. The assistant sighed heavily and told his master that he had heard that the body had been protected from decomposition by magic. The man looked at his assistant with a grin and asked if the Duke was really going to live with a corpse. He, in turn, had been keeping an eye on the Duke ever since he abandoned his family just to find a wife. He said with a grin that the Duke was still a very faithful husband. He looked at the butler intently and asked with a smirk if he knew how to manipulate people. The butler looked closely at the gentleman and asked if it was really necessary to press on weak points. The Duke said that it was so, and all that remained was to threaten. He said with a fierce grin that they needed to be given what they wanted, namely the object of their adoration. He said with a wicked grin that this was the greatest weakness. He understood perfectly well that the Duke's weakness was his dearly beloved Duchess. The Duke spent the whole night near his wife. The man slowly walked up to the window and opened it. He glanced sideways at the Duke and said that it was time to wake up. The Duke looked at the man in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The butler slowly approached the gentleman and said that Duke Pell had arrived to see him. Cassius sighed heavily and said that the Duke, as always, appeared out of the blue. The butler, sighing heavily, looked at the gentleman and apologized. He asked how long he planned to keep the Duchess in the room. The Duke looked at the butler with fury and asked where else he could place his wife. The butler asked for the gentleman's forgiveness and said that he meant the current room, because he knew that now she was in a place where even the sun did not shine. The Duke sighed heavily. He knew that his wife loved to walk in the sun, and she also loved flowers very much. He looked closely at his wife and said that it would be nice if she had a place in the garden. Meanwhile, Duke patiently sat in the drawing room and awaited the audience. Cassius entered the room. The man was surprised, as he did not expect to see someone like him. They had previously said that he was on a drinking binge, but now he clearly saw the Duke's shining face before him. He looked at the Duke intently and asked if he had any problems. Cassius looked at his companion with disdain and said that it was very much like him since he had come without warning. The man sighed heavily and asked for forgiveness. He said that he had heard recent news that the Duchess had died. He started talking about the funeral, but Cassius looked at him angrily and said that it seemed he knew about his wife's death. The Duke looked at his companion with fury and said that he should have heard by now that there would be no funeral. The man sighed heavily and, looking at the Duke, asked whether even if he was clinging to the withered man, he could revive his wife. He asked with a smirk and contempt why Cassius was harboring vain hopes. The Duke looked at his companion with anger and asked if he really thought he was a fool. The man was taken aback and, looking at his companion, said that this was not the case at all and that he respected him very much. He looked at the Duke with a smile and said that, in a sense, he was the one he looked up to and the one he could never be like. He said with a smile that his wife often pesters him about this and always tells him to follow the Duke's example. He said with a grin that if he followed her advice, she might find herself in a similar position to the Duchess now. The Duke looked at the man with fury and said that he must have been saving up ridicule for a long time so that he could shower him with it all at once. The Duke directed his magic at the man with fury. Duke Pell was taken aback and asked his companion to calm down, as he did not come to him to die at his own hands. After he parried the Duke's blow, he noticed that his arm was injured. Duke Pell looked at the Duke intently and said in all seriousness that he thought he could bring the Duchess back to life. The Duke froze in shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked at his companion with fury and told him to stop playing the fool, as he knew that, with his abilities, this was impossible. The Duke looked at the man in surprise and said that he was very brave to say such a thing. The man sighed heavily and said that he was the chief magician who was responsible for protecting the empire. He looked closely at the Duke and asked with a grin what he was willing to do if it was even possible. The Duke looked at his companion with fury and said that he would descend into the abyss if necessary. The man was surprised as he realized that the Duke had fallen into his trap. He looked hard at the Duke and said that, to put it more accurately personally, he was not in a position to do it, but there was someone who should be able to. He asked the Duke if he had heard of sorcerers, of those who seek power that goes against moral principles. The Duke looked at his companion closely and asked if they were not just swindlers. The man sighed heavily and said with a smile that the representatives known to the general public were of course scammers. He smiled and said that the real ones hide their existence, and they also hide the source of their power. The Duke looked at his companion in surprise and asked what he was talking about since he did not know about any source of power. He looked closely at the Duke and said that sorcerers use magic at the cost of someone's life. He sighed heavily and said that if the sorcerer allowed people to find out who he really was, he would confess to at least one murder. The man said that he had heard that those with such powers could revive the dead. He looked at the Duke with a grin and said that there was even a story about a similar successful case. He asked the Duke if he really had never heard of it. The Duke looked at the man with fury and asked if he really looked like an idiot to believe such nonsense. He looked at the Duke intently and said that whether her grace would rise again or not was of no interest to him, but it seemed he was not mistaken that the Duke was interested in this question. The Duke looked at the man intently. He could not answer anything. A moment later, he said with confusion that he only wanted his family to be happy again. The man said that after all, the Bluebell family is a collateral branch of the Valwis family. Sometime later, the young lady and her maids were playing with dolls. The maid sighed heavily and said that for 7 years he had not slept a single night because he missed his love very much. His love told him he was lying because she saw traces of drool around his mouth, and he was sleeping all this time. He said that this happened every time he saw her, since she was so beautiful that he couldn't help it. The young lady, in turn, was in shock as they sat and played with dolls with her. The maids looked at the young lady in surprise, as she was very upset about something. They looked at her in surprise and asked if she wasn't having fun with them. Felicia was taken aback and said that it wasn't so, and that she was having a lot of fun. She said with a beaming smile that they were acting so realistically, and she just couldn't take her eyes off them. She looked at them with a smile and said that her rating was 5 stars. The maid said with a smile that she was simply a goddess of acting. The young lady understood perfectly well that she had to win the maid over to her side, since she wanted to carry out the great operation called escape. She knew that the amount of benefits that the direct descendants of the family received each month was so large that she would not have to worry about money for the rest of her life. Staying in the estate would only contribute to her death. She knew that for this reason she needed to escape, namely to a free country. The young lady understood perfectly well that no one should know about this until then. She wondered what would happen if she suddenly ran away and was caught. She knew that she could be punished and locked up in the estate forever. She understood perfectly well that she needed not only to save a lot of money, but also to safely transfer it to another country. Felicia understood perfectly well that she had to attract several people to her side. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she had something on her face. Felicia looked at the maid with a smile and said that it was not so. A moment later, Lisa entered their room with a smile on her face and called her lady. She smiled and said that she had brought the young lady a cake with whipped cream. The young lady quietly said that she would like cherry pie. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, but said nothing. Felicia was taken aback as she said it without thinking. It took her 3 or 4 times to understand the role of the villain's daughter. She sighed heavily and said that now she wanted cherry pie. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked what to do with the whipped cream cake. Felicia looked at the maid with anger and said that her constant grumbling irritated her. The maid was taken aback and said that she would immediately bring her everything she wanted. The young lady sighed heavily and said that now she wanted Napoleon. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked if she should really take this pie away. The young lady in turn looked intently at the maid, since in her place she would have swallowed the poison long ago. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had something on her face. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said in surprise that she looked at her very strangely. The young lady in turn looked intently at the maid and angrily called her a swear word. The maid was taken aback. She looked at the young lady in surprise and shock and asked what she had just said. The young lady in turn covered her mouth with her hands as she was shocked by herself. She was puzzled and did not understand why she suddenly swore. She understood that she wanted to be good and should behave accordingly. Felicia looked intently at the maid and said with a smile that she had not said anything and thanked her for the cake. She slowly walked away from the maids. The young lady sighed heavily as all the habits frightened her. The maids stared at the young lady with bewilderment. A moment later, they looked at the young lady with tears in their eyes and smiles and said that they were very happy to serve her. She saw that they looked very sad. She was very puzzled as the words just came out of her mouth. Lisa looked at the young lady intently and said that she had no idea, and it must be too hard for the young lady. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked what they were talking about. Lisa looked closely at her friends and asked if they thought the young lady was heartbroken. The maid said that she felt a little awkward because the young lady was trying to act as if everything was okay at such a young age. Sometime later, they were discussing the situation in the servants' room. The maid sighed heavily and wondered how the young lady could remain calm. Lisa sighed heavily and said that it was obvious that the young lady was not all right, but she really hoped that she would get better soon. They knew that she liked very tasty desserts. They couldn't even imagine that she would eat desserts with such a serious expression on her face. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that from now on, she needed to be more careful in her actions as well as her expressions. The maid looked closely at her friends and asked what they do when they are sad. Lisa sighed heavily and said in surprise that she reads romance novels. A moment later, she began quoting from one of the novels. The maid looked closely at her friend and said excitedly that the young lady was still too young and that it would be inappropriate on their part. Lisa sighed heavily and pouted a little as she was asked what she does when she is sad, and she simply told about her method. The maid understood perfectly well that the young lady needed a little time to come to her senses. They knew that she had recently lost her mother and was also having to get used to the sudden change of environment. Lisa sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that, and at any age, you need to put your thoughts in order. She looked at her friends in surprise and asked if they had really bothered the young lady too much. The maids were shocked and couldn't believe that everything had happened this way. Lisa looked closely at her friends. She said that from now on, the mission of a little time alone begins. The maids looked at the young girls in surprise, as they did not understand what was going on at all and what they were talking about so animatedly. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and said that he would be away from the estate for some time. The young man looked at his master intently and said that the young lady would be very upset as she had only recently moved to a new place. He looked at the gentleman and asked, maybe he could still stay with her for a few days? The Duke sighed heavily but did not answer. A moment later, he looked closely at his assistant and said that this was the offer she had expected. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and said that he knew better than anyone how to take care of her. The young man was a little surprised, but a moment later, his expression changed, and he asked the Duke for forgiveness. He felt a little sorry for the young lady, as she was very small. The young lady in turn knew that a lot of time had passed. She was puzzled and surprised because she did not understand why no one from this book spoke to her. She did not understand how she could lure away the maids who were not there. She sighed heavily, knowing that there was no one to even read to her before bed. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that she could read to herself. She understood perfectly well that she no longer had any other choice. She slowly opened the book and began to read the story. The story was about a wolf who was used to always being alone, but someone came to the wolf, and it was a little wolf cub. A moment after the young lady began to read the story, her tears slowly began to flow onto the book. She froze in bewilderment as she did not understand why she was crying. She knew that she was born the daughter of a villain, but she was also human. She was very confused, as she was sad and lonely. Sitting on the bed, she told herself not to cry. She knew that she had to come to her senses. She knew that she was the daughter of a villain, and no one would come to console her. She understood perfectly well that this was normal, and it was not surprising that no one loved her. She knew that she needed to get ready as quickly as possible, since this was her 100th life. A moment later, Alon rushed into her room and grabbed her hands tightly. Lisa looked at the young lady and said that no matter how hard it was for her, she should not hurt herself. The young lady looked away in surprise as she saw many servants. The maid looked at the young lady closely and said that they had left her alone, but she had hurt herself. Lisa told the maid to bring cocoa and a blanket. For the lady, Lily looked at everyone present and said that she would do everything immediately. She looked at everyone closely and said that the mission of a little time alone would be changed. She said that from now on, they would help the young lady as much as possible. Felicia was in shock and did not understand what was going on. Felicia looked at the maid with surprise. She was alone in the room, but she could not understand how the maid knew that she was crying. Lily S. asked her friend if they didn't need to report the incident to his lordship. The maid sighed heavily and said that she didn't know where he was. A moment later, the doctor arrived in the room. He was surprised and puzzled, but he looked at the young lady. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that they could take a look at her bruise. He slowly touched her cheek and said with a smile that fortunately everything seemed to be fine. Lisa looked at the doctor in surprise and alarm and asked if he had really determined this with just one touch to her cheek. He glanced sideways at the maid and said that the young lady had hit herself, and the most one could expect to see was a bruise. Lisa worriedly told the doctor that she had seen with her own eyes how the young lady's delicate cheeks had turned red. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she felt sorry for the poor doctor. Lisa angrily asked the doctor if he was really joking with her. The doctor in turn asked her to calm down. The doctor looked sideways at the young lady and asked with a smile what she had hit herself with. She looked at the doctor intently and said that she had hit herself with her hand. The young doctor was surprised, as he did not expect such a thing. He looked closely at her small hands and, lost in thought, said that it was practically impossible to hurt yourself with them, while Lisa was very worried at the same time. He looked closely at the maid and said that he had found nothing. He looked at the young lady and said that if he prescribed her any medication, there might be unwanted side effects. He sighed heavily and said that he thought it would be better for her to rest a little. The maids asked anxiously if everything was all right with the young lady. Valizia looked closely at the maids. She did not understand why they were all behaving like this. She knew she had simply slapped herself on the cheeks and nothing more. A moment later, she saw the other servants, who were also very worried about the young lady. She looked at them intently and realized that they didn't need to look up from what they were doing to check on her. The young lady in turn was a little alarmed, since before returning to the past during the days of her illness, everything was different. Lisa looked at the doctor with a puzzled expression and said that the young lady's face had turned red. Valizia Z froze in shock as she realized that she was embarrassed. The maid looked closely at the doctor and asked if he had made a mistake in his conclusions. The maids told the doctor that he needed to check everything thoroughly. They did not understand how such a man could call himself a doctor. He looked closely at the young lady as he was well aware that her cheeks could have turned red due to an emotional change. He looked closely at the lady and said that just in case he would prepare an ointment for her. Valicia was taken aback and said that she did not need anything since she was not ill at all. She in turn wanted to forget about everything, but if she didn't do anything, the doctor would be in trouble. The young lady looked at the doctor intently and said that he was absolutely right. She smiled and said that she was just trying to cheer herself up. The maid looked at the young mistress in surprise and asked why she had slapped herself on the cheeks. A moment later, she froze in place, realizing she had made a mistake. As Lisa watched the young lady from afar, she seemed lonely to her. She saw that the young lady was always alone and did not really let anyone near her. She looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes, as she did not understand how lonely she must be if she was slapping herself on the cheeks to cheer herself up. A moment later, she fell to her knees and screamed at the young lady that she was very ashamed of herself. Valicia froze in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. The other maids also said that they were very sorry, because they had made a big mistake. Valizia froze in shock, not understanding what was happening. Lisa sighed heavily and said that in fact, from the moment she arrived at the estate, she wanted to always be near her. She looked closely at Valicia and said that she decided that she needed to be alone. She asked the young lady's forgiveness for standing aside and watching everything that was happening. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that she was watching her from behind a tree so that she would not feel uncomfortable. The young lady in turn was a little embarrassed by this, but she looked at the maid with a smile and said that everything was fine. She was surprised and had no idea about it. She wondered if Lisa thought she was lonely. Lady thought it was very sweet of her. Valizia thought for a moment, since you are in a past life. She did not even suspect that the maid had such an active role. Previously, she thought that the maid was timid because of her. She looked at the maid with a smile and said that she always does this to relieve stress. She said that they don't need to worry about it. All the servants froze in place from shock. They did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady looked at the people present with confusion. She wondered if she had said that it was not so. She knew that it was normal to hit something when someone was annoyed. She understood perfectly well that she was the daughter of a villain and could afford this. She looked in surprise at the doctor, who stood and shook. He looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and said that he could not see the pain in the young lady's heart. A moment later, they fell on their knees and begged the young lady for forgiveness, as they said they were unworthy of serving her. Velitzi was in shock and said that everything was fine. She understood that things had only gotten worse. Lisa walked up to the young lady with a smile and said that she had made a toy for her and that she could hug it when she fell asleep. The young lady looked at her in surprise. A moment later, she saw that the maid was holding a cute kitten in her hands. Lisa greeted the young lady on behalf of the kitten and said that now, this toy was her guardian angel. Lisa, on behalf of the cat, said that she would bite all the strange thoughts that came to her during sleep. The young lady, in turn, was shocked, as this frightened her even more. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she liked the toy, and also if she would like to give the toy a name. Velizia was a little surprised, and about the task, since in her past life she tore up all her toys. She did not know what to do with the toy that was given to her. Lisa pressed the toy and it meowed. She looked at the young lady with a smile and said that the kitten greeted her. The young lady, in turn, slowly took the toy from the maid. She was surprised, as it was the first time she had seen a talking toy. The young lady gently pressed the toy, and it began to meow. She looked intently at her gift. The maid, at the same time, looked at the young lady with a smile, as she saw that she liked the gift. Some time later, the young lady was sleeping quietly in bed with her toy. But a moment later, she woke up because she heard some noise. She wondered what was going on. She thought that most likely a killer had entered the room. The young lady slowly walked to the window and looked out. She froze in shock because she saw an owl who was saying that she urgently needed to tell her something the owl was asking to open the window. The owl shouted at the young lady that she was just a silly girl as she was keeping a guest outside the window. She shouted at her to open it quickly. Velizia looked at the bird with fury and asked who it was that she called stupid. But a moment later, the young lady froze in place as she realized that it was not often that one encountered birds that could speak human language. She froze in place as she realized that this was a creature that did not exist in the world of the novel. She slowly opened the window. The bird looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she was a regression of this world. Velizia looked at the bird in surprise and asked how she knew she was regressing. The owl smiled and told the young lady that she was stupid because she had been living in this world for hundreds of years. Felicia was surprised because she did not expect to hear something like that. She looked closely at the bird and wondered if it was possible that this bird was a helper. She saw that the owl was cute and white and very talkative, and she came when the young lady was alone. She thought for a moment, as she knew that regressors often had helpers. A moment later, the bird screamed very loudly as someone grabbed it sharply. The maid looked at the bird with fury and asked how dare he disturb the young lady's sleep. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not need to be afraid, as she would take care of the annoying bird. Felicia was in shock and did not understand where Lisa came from. She wondered if the maid had been watching her all this time while she slept. She looked at her maid and asked her to let the bird go. The maid looked at the young lady intently and said that she would never do that, since she did not know how many parasites an owl could carry. The bird, in turn, was furious. She looked at the maid intently and asked who it was that she had just called a parasite. The bird screamed that the maid was simply ill-mannered, since he was the most perfect assistant in this world. The young lady looked closely at the maid as she realized that she did not understand what the bird was saying. Lisa said that she would immediately throw the uninvited guest out into the street. Velizia was in shock. She didn't know what to do and how to act in this situation, since she wanted to ask him about a lot of things. A moment later, she tugged at the maid's clothes and asked her to let the bird go. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that since she was so kind, she would not be cruel either. The young lady, in turn, was shocked and did not understand what was being discussed. She wondered how she could get the maid to do what she wanted without looking bad. The young lady looked intently at the maid and said that the birds were her friends. The young lady said with a joyful smile that when she was playing with the stuffed kitten Lisa had given her, It said it wanted to play with the bird. She timidly said that she had invited the bird to a secret meeting and thought it would be a lot of fun to play together. She said that Lisa had ruined everything. The maid froze in shock on the spot. Since the blow was below the belt, she quickly released the bird into freedom. Lisa sighed heavily and said that she had to protect the young lady's heart. Felicia looked intently at the maid and asked if she was in pain. The maid looked at her mistress with a smile and asked if she would invite her next time. Felicia sighed heavily and said that only animal friends could attend the meeting. Lisa looked at the lady with a smile and said that in that case, she would just come in an animal mask. The young lady looked closely at the maid as she was very scared. At the same time, Bird C was sitting on the chandelier and watching them closely. She was very angry that everything happened this way. He screamed furiously that this was the first time he had been treated so harshly in 500 years. The young lady sighed heavily and apologized to the bird, as she did not expect the maid to suddenly appear. He was shocked as she squatted down and grabbed him. The young lady looked closely at the bird and said with a smile that she had something left. She asked if he would like to try. She had a special cake from the chef. He refused and asked how she dared to try to appease her divine assistant with something like that. He said that she had absolutely no manners, but a moment later, he was still eating the wonderful cake with gusto. The young lady looked at the divine assistant with a smile and said that he had a very good appetite. She asked if he had calmed down now. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that after such a delicious dinner, he could introduce himself. He said with a smile that he is her assistant in this world, since he helps those who have regressed to the past, those who have been reborn, and those who are possessed. Felicia looked at him in surprise and asked why she had suddenly returned to the past. He looked at the young lady intently and said that unfortunately he didn't know. She looked at him with surprise and anger and asked what he was talking about. He saw her angry look and became wary. A moment later, he rose into the air and said that he had helped many people, but unfortunately, still not knowing such details. The young lady in turn was shocked. She screamed that she did not believe him. He looked at her intently and said that she was the aggressor and should find out everything on her own. The young lady was shocked and asked why he had come to her. She knew that the assistants did everything themselves, and he in turn simply ate her cake. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that there was another reason why he was here. He used his magic, and a roll of paper began to float in front of the young lady. He looked at the young lady intently and said that she should read it. The young lady began to read slowly and was first congratulated on living her 100th life. She read that she was a gift for her father, and they wrote to her that she should not think that her birth was a mistake. She was told to leave the past in the past, as it was time for her to become part of a new world. She read that unfortunately, her father was in poor health, and she was offered to look after him. The young lady looked at her assistant in surprise after reading the letter. She asked if God had really sent her this. He said that his job was to be an assistant, and giving answers was not his responsibility. The young lady thought for a moment. She didn't know what she should do, since it was the first time she had received such vague instructions. The assistant looked at the young lady with a smile and said that she should find out all this herself. A moment later, he flew away. Felicia was in shock. She screamed in surprise. Was this really all that he wanted to tell her? She screamed angrily at the bird that she had not done her job properly. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. She realized that all the shouting was useless. She was puzzled and did not understand how she could take care of someone who never returned. The next day, the maid looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she wanted to get up already. The lady sighed heavily and said that she did not want to wake up and asked to be given a few more minutes to sleep. She sighed heavily, wondering why the villain's daughter would wake up so early. A moment later, she smelled the wonderful scent of cake. She slowly reached out to the cake that was beckoning her towards it. But a moment later, she was taken aback and looked at the maid. She was shocked because instead of a cake, the maid hugged her tightly. Lisa looked at the young lady with a smile and said that now it was time to wash her face. The young lady in turn screamed with tears in her eyes and asked for her strawberry cake to be returned to her. The maid smiled and told her mistress that she could eat it later. The maid looked intently at the young lady and apologized for her rudeness. She said that today was a special day and she had no choice. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Lisa looked at the young lady with a smile and said that his lordship said that he would arrive today for dinner. She looked at the maid in surprise and asked if her father was really arriving today. The maid looked closely at the young lady and said that when the doctor examined her, she fell asleep for a while, and he checked her relationship to the Duke. She sighed heavily and said that it was quite painful. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she was a direct descendant of Valwis. Lisa said with a smile that it was obvious to everyone that the young lady was just a small copy of his lordship. The young lady, in turn, was surprised, since she did not consider herself a small copy of her father at all. Lisa hoped that the young lady would not turn into his tough version when she grew up. She looked at the young lady intently and said that, in any case, she thought his lordship was returning to see the results of the kinship test. Lisa said that it would have been better if his lordship had acknowledged her earlier. She was wondering what he would do now. The young lady, in turn, sighed heavily, since it was completely unimportant. She was puzzled because she remembered the letter, which said that her father was in poor health, and she needed to look after him. She wondered if she should try to do everything she could for him, if that's what the letter said. She slowly reached for the handle and opened the door. She was getting ready to meet her father. The young lady sighed heavily as she knew that her father had not come just like in her past lives. She was very puzzled as they had never eaten together. She knew that on those occasions when they almost succeeded in doing so, something always ruined their plans. For this reason, she always ate alone. He was focused only on the resurrection of her mother. Everything else did not bother him at all. As the Duchess had said earlier that she was a gift for the Duke, she sighed heavily as she knew that a gift was of course a strong word. The maids whispered quietly among themselves. Since they did not know when the Duke would arrive, they saw that she was alone and impatiently waiting for him. She glanced sideways at the maids, knowing there was no need to take everything seriously. She understood perfectly well that he would not be here this time. The young lady sighed heavily as she was very hungry. She really wanted to throw a tantrum so that they would bring food, but she knew that if she did, she would be no different from her previous self. The Duke's assistant slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that the Duke would be there soon. The young lady looked at him intently, but did not answer. She knew that he would not come. Felicia looked intently at the Duke's assistant, who in turn looked at her with bewilderment. The young lady looked at him intently and asked if she remembered correctly that his name was Agassiz. Bowing, the young man said with a smile that it was a great honor for him that she knew his name. Agassiz, assistant of the House of Valwis. The young man was in charge of the family's finances. The young lady, in turn, knew perfectly well that, in other words, one could say that he was a key figure in her escape scheme. She looked at him with a smile and asked, since it was confirmed that she was a direct descendant, could she now receive money? He said with a smile that she could receive anything but not money. He said that since the little lady was officially recognized as a direct descendant, she would start receiving royalties from next month, and naturally they would accumulate. The young lady smiled and said that she understood everything. She knew that her family was the richest, and even for a small child like her, the monthly allowance was 10 million gold. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that with this scenario, she could buy a house in just a few months. Felicia understood that since she could not change her father into a villain, she was providing herself with a good life. The young man looked closely at the young lady and said in surprise that she had the same smile as the Duke. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She wondered if she really looked like a villain without even realizing it. The young lady timidly said that she was still the Duke's daughter. He smiled and said that it was so. She looked at him intently and said that she was not a little lady at all, but Felicia. He asked the young lady for forgiveness with a smile and again called her little lady. The young lady, in turn, became very angry and said that her name was Felicia. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he would stop calling her that when she grew up. Felicia was furious and wanted to be addressed by her first name. She looked at him with fury and shouted that in that case she would call him baby. He looked at her with a smile and said that in that case they would become friends. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock as she saw that he was a very strange guy. A moment later, a servant entered the room and told Mr. Agus that a letter had arrived. The young lady looked at the letter intently, for she knew that she would finally be told that her father would not come. The young man read the letter slowly, without showing any emotion. A moment later, he looked at the young lady and said with a smile that they should continue their dinner. The young lady in turn understood that it was very good to have no expectations. She wanted to eat and go take a little nap. Validia suddenly realized that she was the daughter of a villain. She understood perfectly well that nothing could change this fact, not even returning to the past. The young lady woke up after her afternoon nap. She was still sleepy, but was already looking for the maid. The young lady in turn was surprised, as she did not find her maid. She wandered leisurely in search. She was surprised, because there was not a soul around. She did not understand what was happening. A moment later, the young lady saw her maid wandering around Valishazid, noticed that her maid was a little agitated. The maid was taken aback, as she did not expect to see her on the lady. Valizia hurriedly approached her maid and asked what was going on. The maid was taken aback and said that everything was fine and nothing was happening. She looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile if she wanted to go back to her room and sleep some more. The young lady was shocked and said that sleep was not the most important thing right now. She glanced sideways at her maid and asked what she was hiding. She wanted Lisa to tell her the truth. The maid smiled and told the young lady that she was not hiding anything. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she heard someone calling for the Duke. She heard someone tell her father that an ancestry test had confirmed that the young lady was a direct descendant of Valwis. Valizia realized that her father was somewhere nearby. She ran to him in a hurry. The servants were shocked because they did not expect the young lady to run to her father. They shouted for her to stop. Agasa looked at his master intently and asked him, how about going to get something to eat, since he hadn't been to the estate for a long time. The Duke looked closely at his subordinate and said that he had come for treatment and would soon leave them again. The young lady saw her father. She knew she had to stop him. A moment later, the young lady rushed towards her father and hugged him tightly. The maids froze in shock. They didn't know what was about to happen. They knew that the young lady still had a small child and were worried. Because they did not want her to get hurt, they whispered quietly to each other. The young lady opened her eyes and froze in shock as she saw blood. She was taken aback and looked at her hands, which were covered in blood. The young lady slowly raised her eyes to her father and saw his hard gaze. She froze looking at the Duke as she saw that he was covered in blood. She was taken aback and began to back away as he had scared her greatly. She was in shock as now he looked exactly the same as on the day of their execution. Agasa approached the master and said that he didn't expect the little lady to wake up so early. He said that it seemed like she ran here because she wanted to meet her father. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had seen something he should not have seen. He said that it would be better for him to leave as quickly as possible. The young lady in turn froze in place, looking at her father. She saw his swollen eyes. She looked closely at the Duke and wondered if he had been crying. She knew that in the past, from the very first day they lived in different buildings. She only knew that her father was very busy, as he was trying to revive her mother. She was shocked because she couldn't even imagine that he would cry. She looked at us intently, her father, because she understood that even in this life, he had lost his Vivienne. She in turn tried furiously to pretend that she didn't care, and that it had nothing to do with her. She understood perfectly well that her father was just a man who had lost his way after losing his wife. She understood that he was not just a villain. The young lady was furious because she knew that this could not go on, and he should not live like a villain. She looked at her father closely and called out to him. She slowly approached him and said that if she were her mother, she would be worried. The young lady told her father that her mother had told her that skipping meals was very bad. The Duke in turn froze in shock as he did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at him with a smile and said that she would be worried that he might get sick from the hunger strike. For a while they looked at each other in silence without saying a word. After a while, the Duke said that in that case, he would eat some food. The young lady was very happy, and she knew that this was a small victory. He came closer to her, and she froze in place in shock. The Duke looked at everyone present with a bow and said that they should prepare some bread for him and for the child what she usually eats. The young lady was shocked and also very surprised, because it was the first time in her life that he took her in his arms. She was surprised because it was the first time that they would have lunch together. Some time later, they were sitting in the dining room. The young lady thanked everyone with a smile for the wonderful food. She slowly enjoyed the delicious food as all the dishes were prepared, especially for her. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she seemed to have a very good appetite. The young lady in turn ate leisurely and said with a smile that her mother really liked those who ate well. She looked closely at her father and asked if he was not eating. He said that he was eating now. She looked at him intently and asked when it was now. The Duke in turn did not answer and looked intently at the bread. The chef looked at the Duke puzzledly and asked if he would like to try something else. The young lady looked at her father intently and asked if he knew how much work it took to get bread to the dinner table. The Duke froze in shock. She looked at him intently and asked if he thought bread just fell from the sky. She looked at him intently and told him to say thank you for the delicious food and then eat it. He remembered how his wife also told him not to leave anything behind. She asked him if he knew how many people worked on all the dishes. She looked at her father intently and said that if he didn't finish eating, she would scold him. The Duke stood frozen in shock as his daughter spoke the same words as his wife. He breathed heavily and told his daughter that her mother had said the same thing. The young lady was taken aback for a moment and fell silent. A moment later, she looked at her father with a smirk as she now knew how she should behave around her father. She looked at him intently and said that what Mom hated most was when someone left something on the table. The Duke drooped and looked intently at the bread he held in his hand, for he had no appetite at all. The young lady said with tears in her eyes that her mother would be very upset if she saw this. She said that this was very bad and she was very worried. The young lady froze because she saw that her father put the bread aside. She looked closely at her father, who was very upset. She thought that she seemed to have gone a little too far. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and asked if mother would scold her. Felicia was in shock. She wondered if he really said that. She didn't know what to answer to his question and timidly began to mumble something. A moment later, she said that her mother would have grabbed her cheeks and she would have had to lose her precious cheeks. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and calmly said that with such an appetite, she could sleep peacefully. He finished his bread and wished her bon appetit. The young lady was shocked. She did not understand why he sat down if he was going to leave in a minute anyway. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it seemed like her father was very angry. Lisa looked at the young lady intently and said that it was not that simple. The Duke had already eaten all his food. Felicia was surprised because she did not understand when he managed to do this. Lisa looked at the cook with a smile and asked if he saw the empty plate. The cook, with a smile on his face and tears in his eyes, said that the Duke was constantly undereating, but all thanks to the young lady. Felicia looked at them in surprise and asked if this was true. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed that villains also needed to eat well. The maid looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. The young mistress sighed heavily and said nothing. The girl looked at the blood of the 10-year-old deer with joy and pleasure. She knew that blood was very valuable, but he really managed to get it. The Duke looked closely at the girl and said that she had said earlier that she could bring his wife back to life. She said with a smile that this was true and that she was the only witch who could resurrect the dead. She said with a smile that this would be enough. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this was all. She looked at him with a smirk and asked if he could bring her something else. The Duke said with fury that she had said earlier that this would be enough. The young lady looked at the Duke with a smile. She knew that it was very bad that his mood was getting worse. She smiled and said that everything was right. He came closer to her and grabbed her hand in a furious manner. The Duke asked if she really used poison to revive the dead. The young lady was taken aback and excitedly asked what he was talking about. He looked at her with fury and said that she was trying to add it to the potion right now. Trembling with fear, she said that it was exactly like that. She asked with a smirk if he was really interested in this. He looked at her with cold fury and said that he had just killed a bunch of people and knew about such things. A moment later, he used his magic. The young lady froze in place as she found it difficult to breathe. He looked at her with fury and said that she had lied to him. She trembled and said that she could resurrect his wife. The Duke looked at her with fury and said that it was not so, and she could not do it. The young man looked at the gentleman intently and asked if this witch would not help them either. The Duke said angrily that it was time for them to leave. A moment later, the Duke froze in place as he saw the young girl crash into him. He looked at her in surprise and asked who she was. The little girl was trembling with fear. She asked to spare her. The Duke looked sideways at the little girl and said that he had no intention of killing her since she had done nothing wrong. She looked at him in surprise and asked if this meant that he would take her as a slave. He looked at her in surprise, and she sighed heavily and told her that there was no slavery in this empire. The young girl was very frightened. She looked intently at the Duke without saying a word. She glanced sideways at the woman who was already dead. She was afraid that he might kill her too, since she was a prisoner of that woman. The Duke looked closely at his subordinate and told him to deal with the witch and also find those who could take care of the child. The Duke looked closely at his subordinate and said that he should definitely check their backgrounds carefully. The girl looked closely at the Duke. She was very surprised, but at the same time grateful to him. The Duke looked at his companion and said that this time they had also come across a swindler. He sighed heavily and said that he had never thought it would be so easy. He looked closely at his assistant and asked what was wrong with the child. The young man sighed heavily and told his master that he had sent her to respected people. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was very good. For a moment he froze, as it seemed to him that his eyesight was failing him. He knew it was not the same at all, but he thought of his daughter, who was also trembling and begging for mercy. In turn, he was very glad that he could find her before it was too late. The Duke sighed heavily and asked his subordinate if she always ate alone. The young man looked at the gentleman in surprise, as he did not understand what he was talking about. The Duke looked at him intently and said that he was talking about his daughter now. The servant sighed heavily and told his master that this was exactly the case. Agasa S. asked the gentleman if he could organize a meal together for them again after they finished their business. He smiled and said that the young lady would like it. The Duke sighed heavily and told his subordinate that he was meddling in something that was none of his business. He said that his wife was now in first place. The young man sighed heavily and said that he understood his master. The Duke glanced sideways at his subordinate and said that if there was time left, they would return back. The young lady was surprised as events took an unexpected turn in this new life. In the midst of her plan, the secret animal gathering invented because of Lisa was gathering more and more followers. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that they loved her very much. She wondered if they could help her plan as she was very interested in it. A moment later, the maids noticed that there were no goodies, and there were no more. Lisa said with a smile that she would go now and bring everything. All the servants ran to bring the young lady something tasty. She wanted to stop them, but they did not listen to her, and she was left alone. The young lady was surprised, as she could never have thought that she would be loved so much. She understood that she should have been more polite with the maids. She wondered if it would be better if her father were a fool. A moment later, someone called her name, and she was taken aback. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and asked what she was doing there. The young lady looked at her father in surprise, as she did not expect to see him at all. He looked at her intently and said with sadness in his voice that she was alone as usual. The young lady froze in place in surprise, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He lifted his daughter into his arms with lightning speed and said that they needed to go around to eat. The young lady, in turn, was surprised and wanted to object since she knew that her maids would be very worried about her. The Duke angrily said that he would deal with the maid who left her alone here later. The young lady was shocked. She shouted that this was not so, and no one left her. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he couldn't believe that she was as sweet as her mother. He said that she only took over her strange traits. Felicia looked at her father with bewilderment as she didn't understand what he was talking about. Sometime later, they were eating together in the dining room. The young lady thought about the spirit world for a moment. Then, one girl said that she was the main character in a tragic story, but now she has changed her life with the help of regression. Her friends were surprised and asked how she did it. She said with a smile that she made friends with the villains. She said that if everything was done properly before the main events began, the original story would change. The young lady sighed heavily when she heard about this. Then she wondered if she should try to do something similar too. In turn, she understood that this could not be done since she was a professional supporting character and had to adhere to the original plot. But she also knew that this was her chance since she had received God's grace. She understood perfectly well that if she was going to get a response to her letter now, she would first need to get closer to her father. The young lady, in turn, wondered whether she should try to turn this terrible tragedy into something new. She looked at her father intently and called out to him with a smirk on her face. She said with a smile that the steak was absolutely delicious. After her words, an awkward silence hung in the hall. Everyone present waited for the Duke to answer her somethings. The chef said with a smile that he was very honored that the young lady found his dish delicious. The maid smiled and said that it was natural, since it was a steak from the chef himself. The young lady paused for a moment to consider how much she had learned about the spirit world over the course of her many lives. She looked closely at her father, as she knew very well that he was not very good at expressing his feelings right now. She hoped he thought she was very cute, since the daughter looked exactly like her villain father. She asked her father with a smile what he liked. She said with a smile that she really liked steak and cake. She looked at her father closely and asked if he would like to try some strawberry cake. The Duke sighed heavily, but said nothing. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that she would not get any reaction from him, and for this reason she wanted to try the last means on him. She slowly approached him closer, as she wanted to feed him. She looked at him with a smile and said that it was her favorite cake. The Duke in turn looked intently at the young lady, but there was no reaction. She smiled, and handing him a fork said that if he ate it, she froze in place with a smile. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and asked what would happen if he ate it. Felicia was in shock because she understood that it was hopeless since he was very cold towards her. She told herself that she should calm down, as his reaction was to be expected. She was furious and wondered what would happen if he just ate a piece. She looked at him intently as she was still holding the tree. The Duke looked at her in bewilderment. Felicia was furious and wondered if he couldn't take the hint. Felicia looked intently at the Duke and said that if she was holding her fork with food like this, it meant that she really wanted him to eat it. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked at what stage he should do this. The young lady looked at her father in surprise and asked if they shouldn't share what they liked with each other. He looked at her intently and said that it was not so. The young lady in turn was shocked. She was very upset by his words. She sighed heavily and said with sadness in her voice that they were a family and they ate together. She was surprised, looked at him and asked if it was because he wanted to talk to her. The Duke looked at her intently and said that it was not so. The young lady in turn froze in place in shock. Felicia was a little puzzled, and she didn't understand why he behaved this way. She was puzzled and did not understand why he decided to eat with her, and now he was so cold. A moment later, the cake fell to the ground. The Duke glanced sideways at the maid and told her to clean it up. The young lady in turn was furious. She shouted that she had given her father her favorite dessert. She shouted with all her anger that he refused her favorite dessert. The Duke froze in shock as he did not expect such a thing. Moments later, the young lady handed him a fork containing a small piece of cake. She looked at her father with tears in her eyes. A moment later, she turned away from him in anger and said that she would eat alone. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and said that this was exactly what had been bothering him. The young lady looked at her father in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. The Duke sighed heavily and said that this was the reason he was here. He came closer to her and timidly said that he thought it would be much worse to deprive her of food. He looked closely at the fork she was still holding and said there was still some cake left on it. A moment later, he ate the cake that was on the fork. The young lady froze in place from embarrassment. She was shocked and happy at the same time. She looked at her father with a smile and asked if he liked it. She knew that the dessert was very tasty. He looked at her intently and said that it was exactly like that. The Duke looked at his daughter with a sad look and asked if he should eat more. The young lady looked at her father with a smile and said that was enough. The young lady in turn leisurely wandered around the estate. She was very happy and recalled today with a smile. She knew that today she had not eaten her ration of desserts. The young lady wondered with a smile if there was anything left in the kitchen. A moment later, she heard some noise. She was in shock and didn't understand what was happening because she heard someone crying. The young lady decided to check where the sound was coming from. She froze in place as she saw her father's assistant collecting the shards of glass. The young man looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what she was doing there. The young lady in turn froze in place from shock as she did not expect to see such a thing. She looked intently at the young man and asked what he was doing. Agasa was taken aback and looked intently at the young lady. A moment later, he looked at her intently and told her to freeze in place and not move. The young lady in turn did as he said. He was agitated and said that she might step on shards of glass. Moments later, she heard someone crying. Looking into the room, she saw her father sitting on the ground and crying bitterly. She was shocked and wondered if it was he who had destroyed the room. She looked at her father with sadness, as she had no idea that he missed her mother so much. Felicia sighed heavily and said that she was very worried about her father. Agasa sighed heavily and said that he was also very worried, but he was so determined that the word afraid would be more appropriate. The young lady in turn sighed heavily and said that they should be worried. He looked at her intently and asked if she really thought so. Agasa looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he thought that his lordship would soon cherish her even more. The doctor looked closely at the Duke and said that he was very ill and needed to get a good rest. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it seemed to be a common illness. Agasa was very agitated. He looked at the gentleman and asked him to go back to bed. Otherwise, he would get even worse. The Duke sighed heavily and said that it was not fatal. He looked at his master intently and said that he would cancel all his business for today. The Duke was taken aback on the spot and asked his subordinate what he was talking about. Agasa sighed heavily and, looking at his master, said that he would have to disobey his order just this once. He asked the Duke if he didn't understand the seriousness of the whole situation. The Duke in turn did not want to listen to anything. He knew what he had to do. Breathing heavily, he looked at everyone present with anger and said that his wife was also sick. He looked at them with anger and asked who was next to her when she was sick. He said that he also needed to experience this. The Duke's assistant was in shock. He wanted to stop his master, but it was all in vain. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he needed to feel her pain. He said that he was leaving. Agasazi froze in place from shock. He understood that he should have been more decisive and stopped his master. He was very angry with himself, as he was ashamed to even be called his assistant. He thought for a moment, as he thought that it would probably be difficult for any person to resist the Duke. The young lady sat in the beautiful gazebo for a moment, thinking, wondering if her bird was going to return. A moment later, she froze in place as she saw her father's assistant. The young man looked at the young lady with fear and called her. Lisa looked at the young man with fury and asked how he addressed the young lady. She said that he was simply terrible. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that this was just a stupid nickname, but she needed to teach him a lesson. She looked at him intently and asked him what was going on. She called him baby. He froze in surprise and embarrassment. The maids looked at him sideways and mocked him. A moment later, he decided to tell her why he came to her, but he did not have time to begin telling her this situation, when suddenly the doctor ran up to the young lady and called her. The doctor looked at the young lady with concern and asked her to stop the Duke. The maid looked at the doctor in surprise and asked if everything was all right with him as she saw his worried face. Agasa looked intently at the young lady and said that his lordship had completely gone mad. Everyone present froze in shock, as they did not expect to hear such a thing from the Duke's assistant. Lisa looked at the young man in surprise. She was very angry and simply could not believe that he was saying such things about the Duke. Agasa sighed heavily and said that the Duke was still ill, but he had decided to leave the estate. He was very puzzled by this situation. Looking at the young lady, he said that if the Duke left in such a bad state, it would only make things worse for him. The young lady in turn frowned and thought. She wondered if she should stop her father and try to influence the original plot. She knew that, in theory, it was possible. She understood perfectly well that she was first and foremost his daughter, and only then a professional supporting character. The Duke stood frozen in surprise as he heard his daughter calling him. The Duke looked at his assistant with anger and said that he told him not to transfer the child. Agasa looked intently at the Duke and said that everyone was worried about him. The Duke angrily asked his assistant, since when he had been responsible for his health. The Duke angrily asked, since when it had become the assistant's duty to interfere in his personal life. He shouted that he should not have done it at all. He looked closely at his daughter and told his assistant to take her away immediately. The young lady in turn looked intently at her father and asked if he was leaving. The Duke said that everything was exactly like that. She looked at him in surprise and asked where he was going. The Duke froze in place but did not answer. She looked at him intently. A moment later, the young lady looked at her father with a smile and wished him a safe journey. The Duke froze in shock, not expecting her to simply wish him a good trip. Agasa looked at the young lady in surprise, as he did not understand why she was saying such things, as she should, on the contrary, have stopped her father. She looked at him in surprise and said that such things happen. She glared at her father's assistant and told him not to talk to her father like he was some kind of weirdo. The Duke froze in shock, as he didn't expect to see something like that. She looked at her father closely and said that he was not strange at all. The young lady sighed heavily and said that her father was just sad. Valizia understood perfectly well that he simply did not want to accept the fact that he had lost his love forever. She looked closely at her father and with a gentle smile said that everything was fine, but he should not forget to eat. The young lady looked at him intently, with a smile on her face, as she understood him perfectly. The Duke froze in shock, as he had not expected to see anything like this. A moment later, he remembered his wife, as she had disappeared, after telling him that she loved him. She had disappeared without saying a word or explaining the reason to him. And then, after a while, his daughter, the cunning child, appeared, who looked like her father. He remembered her grinning as she told the Baron that they would start with the fingers. He remembered her expression, which clearly reminded him of his own. She had the same deep black hair and the same violet eyes. He saw his wife in the words and actions of his child. He remembered how she had looked at him intently and said that she would definitely scold him. He remembered her saying that her mother would grab her by the cheeks and she would have to lose her precious cheeks. The young lady tenderly touched her father's face and with a gentle smile told him not to forget to eat. For a moment he froze as he saw his own wife in her. He was shocked, because only then did he realize what a fool he had been. Now he realized that it was not he who had lost his wife, but they both had lost one person. He looked closely at his daughter and said that he thought it would be better for him to leave a little later. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not expect such a thing. He smiled at her with a gentle smile and said that they should eat first, and for dessert, they would have strawberry cake. The servants present froze in place in shock, as they did not expect such a thing. He looked at his daughter with a smile and said that it was time for them to go calling her by name. She looked at her father with surprise and embarrassment and asked if they were going to have strawberry cake afterwards. The Duke looked at his daughter with a tender smile and said that they would certainly do so. He smiled and said that this time Dad would eat everything without dropping a single piece. Valizia Z froze in place, as she did not expect to hear something like that. But a moment later, her expression changed, and she looked at her father with a smile, as she was very happy. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and said that she should open her mouth wider. Valizia in turn did everything as the doctor said, without resisting. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was healthy and everything was fine. The young lady in turn was very pleased. She did not know whether she had played the role that she had slapped herself on the cheeks, but he kept his promise and became her devoted doctor. She looked at him with a smile and thanked him for examining her. He smiled and thanked her for staying healthy. He looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile if she was dining with the Duke that day. She smiled and said that she was. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that from now on this would become an integral part of her life. The doctor looked at the young lady closely and said that they were very worried about his lordship, and for this reason they tried to stop him, but the young lady actually saved the situation. Felicia said puzzledly that she did nothing at all. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he had a gift for her. The doctor looked at the young lady with a smile and said that he would prepare a nutritional supplement for her that would help her grow faster. He looked at her intently and said that from now on, the young lady would become the strongest in the empire. Valizia was shocked, as she did not expect to see something like this from the doctor. She looked at him intently as she saw that he was beaming with happiness, as he was pleased that he had brought her such a gift. She decided to play along with him a little and said with a smile that she would take a nutritional supplement and become the strongest in the empire. She asked him for forgiveness, but this was the maximum of false emotions. He looked closely at the young lady and said that even now she is already the strongest in the empire. Moments later, they heard some noise. Agasa slowly entered the young lady's room. Valicia looked at him intently as she saw that he was worried. He looked at her intently and asked how she was feeling. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really come as he was sick. The young man said that he was not ill at all, as he simply wanted to see the little lady, and for this reason he came. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wanted to meet her in person. A moment later, he fell to his knees and called out to the young lady. Valicia was in shock and did not understand why he suddenly acted like this. He looked closely at the young lady and thanked her for having managed to dissuade the Duke from going. She looked at him intently and said that if he hadn't told her, she probably wouldn't have known about it. He sighed heavily and said that, to be honest, he didn't immediately understand her intention. He said he was very angry that she did not stop the Duke. Agasa sighed heavily and said that he was very ashamed of himself. He said with sadness in his voice that he just wanted his lordship to return to his normal state. He said that unfortunately, he did not even try to understand the true cause of his illness. The young lady looked at him and called out. He looked intently at the young lady, who smiled radiantly at him. She said with a smile that the fact that he was so worried about her father already proved that he was a valuable person to him. The young man was shocked. He looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Valicia was in shock and did not expect him to cry. She expected a different reaction from him and did not want to make him cry at all. He sighed heavily and said, "Young lady," that he thought he was not worthy of being called an assistant. A moment later, they heard someone's voice and turned around. They froze in place as they saw the Duke in all his glory. The Duke looked at his assistant with fury and asked what he was doing in front of the child. Agasa sighed heavily and said that the young lady had spoken very wise words. Vioitzia, in turn, rushed to her father, with a smile on her face. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and said that it was already time for dinner. She smiled at him with a radiant smile, as she was glad to see him. The Duke looked intently at his subordinate and called him. Agasa, in turn, without looking up at the gentleman, said that he was listening to him. The Duke sighed heavily and told his assistant that if he was crying for him, he should do it in front of him. The Duke looked at him intently and told him not to frighten the child without reason. Agasa looked at the Duke in surprise and shock, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock on the spot, as she also did not expect to hear such a thing from her father. The Duke sighed heavily and told his assistant that he couldn't even believe that he was leaving his job for something like this. The Duke said that he was very disappointed. The Duke glanced sideways at his assistant and said that he needed rest. The young man was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing. After the Duke left with his daughter, he told the Duke with tears in his eyes that he would serve him for the rest of his life. He shouted that no matter what happened, he would not give up in the future. The maids were shocked. They did not understand why he was behaving like this. The Duke sighed heavily and said that his assistant had simply gone crazy. Everyone present laughed. Agasa. You heard the Duke's words, and with tears in his eyes, asked him why he was saying that. After the day when the Duke fell ill, he remained at the estate, although the young lady at first thought that he would leave immediately after their joint dinner. The Duke looked at the doctor with fury and asked why he did not immediately report that the child was sick. The Duke said with fury that if this was done on purpose, then he would be in trouble. The Duke learned that the doctor had been visiting the young lady, frequently concerned about her psychological state, so he stayed at the estate for an unusually long period of time until she got better. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled, as she did not know what was happening. The Duke looked intently at his daughter and called her. The young lady looked at her father in surprise, as she was well aware that the invisible wall between them had fallen. The Duke said that he was going to go downtown today. He sighed heavily and said that he heard that an alchemist was hiding there who could resurrect the dead. She knew that she was at the walls, and between them she fell after he began to tell her where and why he was going. She sighed heavily because she knew that all these people were swindlers. She looked closely at her father and asked when he intended to go into town. Cassius said he would like to do so before dinner. She in turn was very pleased with herself since eating at a certain time is a strict tradition. She knew his role was to be the villain, but it was important to maintain a work-life balance. She looked at her father closely and said with a smile that she agreed with him and also wished him a safe trip. The night that should have been serene. The estate turned upside down. Valizia held the cake tightly in her circles and stared out the window as she waited for her bird helper to fly to her. Valizia sighed heavily as she realized that the bird would not fly in today either. She wondered if she was busy with something else. She sighed heavily because she understood that she had to immediately find out what that suspicious letter wanted from her. A moment later, she heard the bird calling her. He asked her not to take the cake away. The titmouse was indignant. He asked if she wasn't going to give that cake to him. The young lady in turn turned around and saw her bird. She was very glad that he had finally flown to her. She said with a smile that she had been waiting for him and handed him the cake. Titmouse fell into the cake with a crash. The young lady was shocked and froze looking at the bird. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that he had a letter for her. He smiled and said that she could read it while her assistant ate. The young lady in turn was very happy as she had been waiting for this for a very long time. She looked at her assistant with a smile and said that she had something to do and he could eat cake in peace. He agreed with a satisfied smile. The young lady thought that this letter would tell her to follow the original plot. She looked at the letter intently and with surprise, because in it she saw praise for the fact that her relationship with her father had improved. She was warned that leaving the estate was very dangerous, and she was also asked if she would like to ask him not to do something like that. They were sure that he would listen to her, since his daughter's words were law for him. The young lady in turn was surprised, since she understood that they wanted to change the original. She was surprised and did not understand what they wanted to achieve. She understood that this person was in no way connected with her father, but it was strange to read something like this. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that everything was connected because of her return to the past. The bird's assistant looked at the young lady in surprise and asked what had happened as her face had changed greatly and she had become quiet. The young lady wondered for a moment if it was normal for the plot to change. He flew closer to her and asked anxiously if she could hear him. The young lady D thought about everything. Since she wanted him to know a lot, he was excited. He did not ask the lady if she was ignoring him. A moment later, he could not stand it, since she did not answer him. And with the speed of lightning, he pecked her. Valizia looked up from her letter and stared at him. Titmouse stared at the young lady and said that he had recreated the question for her. She apologized as she thought for a moment. She looked closely at her assistant and asked if she wrote a letter, would he be able to deliver it. He thought for a moment and said that according to the rules, it would be difficult since all his messages do not come from the mortal world. Titmouse did not recall a single such case at all. The young lady looked at him with alarm and asked if he could tell her who had written the letter. He turned away from the young lady and said that of course he would not tell her. He looked at her intently and asked if she had forgotten the situation she was in. Valizia's face sank, and she said that of course she knew everything, but she never thought that everything would turn out exactly like this. She looked closely at her assistant and asked if it was really impossible to find out anything from the author or even write a response. He sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. A moment later, the young lady angrily tore the letter apart in front of him. He looked at her with surprise and confusion and asked what she was doing. Valizia looked at him with a smirk and said that she was no stranger to ignoring people. He looked closely at the young lady and said that in his long life he had seen many problematic repressors, but she was the first one who had so openly rebelled. She looked at her assistant intently and said with fury that the conversation was a cozy matter, and she could also express her opinion. She looked at him intently and said that this was not at all contrary to the rules of a person. N, a help of specialists of the spiritual world. He looked at her in surprise and asked why she had torn the letter so mercilessly. The young lady sighed heavily and asked what a good photo was, so as not to tell her the reason for her return to the past. She said that since she could not answer, she would express her thoughts through actions. Valizia looked intently at her assistant and said that she was completely sure that the sender would soon send her a normal answer. Titmouse looked at the young lady and said that the sender would try to eat her alive. Titmouse was puzzled by the young lady's behavior. He said that there was a reason for everything. He also asked her if it was really so difficult for her to understand Valizia. In turn could not stand it and said with fury in her voice that she was already living this life for the 100th time. She screamed furiously to live like rain, like a villain, and not even know why. She looked at her assistant intently and shouted that she had no idea when this would all end. Valizia said that he didn't even know how hard life was when she had to do what she was told. He looked at Valicia intently and snorted, as he was dissatisfied with her behavior. The titmouse said that he lived the same way as she did, but he was puzzled and did not understand what was wrong with her. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, as she knew that it would be very good if her father were not a villain. She realized that he had had a hard day today. She remembered being told she should be strong, since she was born the daughter of a villain. But in turn, she wondered where the justice was. With tears in her eyes, she picked up the piece of torn letter. Valizia angrily shouted at her assistant that since he was no helper, then he could pay her back for the cake. A moment later, she froze in place as she heard her father calling her. She turned around and saw her father staring at her. He looked at her in surprise and asked who should pay her for the cake. He asked who she was calling a stupid bird. The young lady in turn froze in place from your cat, as she understood that everything was very bad. The Duke looked at the maid with fury and said that she should have protected her and treated her appropriately in his absence. He looked at the maid with fury and said that she had taught her obscenity instead. The maid trembled with fear. She timidly asked the Duke what he meant. He looked at her intently. Ione did not say that he meant what he said. He asked with fury what she said in the presence of his daughter. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He asked angrily if she was pretending to be innocent. Now Valicia was shocked because she knew that her maid had done nothing wrong. The Duke looked closely at the maid and said that the child was a reflection of an adult. The maid hastily swore that she had never said anything bad in the presence of the young lady. He looked at her with fury and asked how she would then explain leaving the child alone in the garden. The Duke said that a few days ago he definitely wanted to be there unattended. He asked angrily if this was appropriate behavior for a servant. The young lady in turn was shocked, as she knew that this was a simple misunderstanding, since her maid had then gone away for a minute to get a cake. The Duke sighed heavily and said that Lisa, as the maid who was responsible for her, was terrible. Lisa in turn steadfastly withstood criticism directed at her, but a moment later, she couldn't stand it any longer and shouted that he himself had made many mistakes regarding the upbringing of the young lady. The Duke was frozen in place from shock. Valizia was simply in shock as their conversation was going in the wrong direction. The maid sighed heavily and said that of course she was not without her faults as a maid. She looked at the master intently and said that as a servant who was in charge of the young lady, she was always by her side. She looked at the master intently and said that he should pay more attention to her. He looked at her angrily and asked what she was talking about. Lisa sighed heavily and looking at the Duke, said that he went out to drink every night, and the young lady always waited for his return. Valicia ran up to them with lightning speed and said that they must stop immediately. Moments later, the Duke's assistants grabbed her from the ground and lifted her up. She looked at him in surprise as she did not expect to see him. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that she should not interfere. The Duke looked at the maid with anger and asked if she realized what she was saying. The maid looked intently at her master and said that, as he himself had said earlier, the child is a reflection of an adult. She glanced sideways at the young lady and said that when you look at the Duke, you can't help but wonder what the young lady is feeling. She looked at her master intently and said that this was clearly having a bad effect on her. Lisa looked at the Duke intently and said that he was the worst father. The Duke froze in shock as these words struck him to the depths of his soul. On this day, the Duke suffered a crushing defeat. The young lady in turn was in shock and did not know what to do. She could no longer bear this. The maid looked intently at the master and asked for forgiveness, as it was her mistake. Valizia looked at them in surprise and asked why they were suddenly saying such offensive things to each other. The young people froze in shock as they did not expect to hear such things from her. She looked at them intently and said that she loved her father and her maid very much. She looked closely at the maid and said with a smile that she was good at everything and she had no need to become even better. The maid looked at the young lady with tears in her eyes and said that her dream was to serve the young lady for the rest of her days. Valicia was shocked because she realized that her words had the opposite effect, and it only made things worse. The young lady in turn decided to change her goal, and looking at her father said that he was the best. She looked at him intently and said that he ate with her 3 times a day. He looked at her intently and asked what else they were doing. Besides this, the young lady looked at her father with a confused smile on her face and asked what he was talking about. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he no longer does anything for his daughter. He was shocked. Only he understood that if his wife saw him, she would be upset. The young lady was shocked as her father behaved just like a servant. A moment later, they heard a noise and turned around. They froze, looking at the commander of the knights. The commander, in turn, was breathing heavily. The Duke looked at him in surprise and asked what had happened. The commander looked closely at the gentleman and said in a hurry that the matter concerned the Viscount who had been sent to the dungeon. The Duke, with lightning speed, said that he was already on his way. The Duke quickly picked up his daughter in his arms and walked with her. The young lady looked at her father in surprise, as she could not believe that he was taking her with him. She sighed heavily, knowing that a normal father would not bring his daughter to a place like this. She wondered if the feeling that he was the worst father didn't bother him. She was shocked and wondered if he was planning on dragging her everywhere with him now. The Duke looked closely at his daughter and told her that she needed to close her eyes. He placed his palm on her face and closed her eyes. The Duke looked closely at the commander of the knights and asked if the Viscount had really hit the child. The commander said that this was exactly how it should be. He had gone mad after 4 months of imprisonment. The young lady in turn froze in surprise, as she did not understand which child was being discussed. He knelt down, cried, and told the Duke that such a life was unbearable for him, since he had already been in prison for 122 years. The Viscount begged the Duke to have mercy on him, as he was already going mad. The young lady in turn sighed heavily, as she saw that he now looked more like an animal. She looked intently at the Viscount, as she did not understand who he had hit. But a moment later, she saw her friend. She wondered if the Viscount had hit Sion. The Duke looked at the commander of the knights with anger and asked how that slave got there. He was very angry since they had to send him for treatment. The commander guilty said that they only found out about it now that they entered the dungeon. The commander said that it seemed that the Viscount had been so violent that the knights simply did not pay attention. The knights looked intently at the Duke and said that they were very ashamed. The Duke looked at his knights with fury and asked if they were also so careless about their own lives. The young lady looked closely at her father and said that the child needed treatment. The Duke looked at his daughter in surprise and asked who needed treatment. She looked closely at her father and said excitedly that it was Xian who needed treatment. She said that they were the same age and he clearly needed help. She looked closely at her father and said that she liked a dad who treated children. The Duke, with lightning speed, ordered the knights to quickly show the child to the doctor. Valicia was in shock as she realized that she could easily manipulate her father. A moment later, the young man was placed on a stretcher as they wanted to take him to the doctor and provide him with medical assistance. The captain walked slowly up to the Duke and called him. He said that the Viscount was becoming increasingly uncontrollable. He looked at the gentleman and asked if they should begin the preparations. The Viscount looked at everyone present in surprise and asked if they were really going to free him. The Duke in turn looked at the Viscount with fury, and he began to tremble with fear. The commander looked at his master intently and said that if this was a concern to him, they would take care of everything. The Duke in turn did not answer. A moment later, looking at his daughter, he called her the young lady, looked at her father in bewilderment as she did not understand what he wanted to talk to her about. The Duke looked at his daughter closely and asked with a grin if they should start with the little finger. The young lady in turn looked intently at her father with a satisfied grin on her face, while the Viscount was trembling with fear. Agasa looked at the young lady with a worried expression and said that he would take her away. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that if she took his hand now, she would go upstairs. She sighed heavily, because she knew that everything would end with the execution of the Viscount. Agasa looked at the lady as she did not take his hand, and went somewhere in a hurry. Felicia approached her father and called him. The Duke looked at his daughter in bewilderment. She understood perfectly well that if he killed the Viscount, now everything would be the same as in his past life. He looked at his daughter in surprise and asked what was the matter. The knights looked closely at the young lady as they understood that she was still very soft-hearted. They knew that she was only 5 years old, and this was quite normal for her age. They looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she did not need to worry, as they would do everything in their power, and it would be painless. Felicia looked intently at her father and said that she needed money. The Duke and everyone present looked at the young lady in bewilderment. The Duke came closer to his daughter and asked what she was talking about. She looked intently at her father and asked what would happen to the Viscount's assets after his death. Agasa looked at the little lady with a worried expression and said that most likely they would all go over to Valwis. The young lady sighed heavily and muttered incoherently about payment for her work. The Duke looked at his daughter in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She looked at her father with a smile and said that he should deduct the cost of her slave labor from his fortune. Felicia understood perfectly well that previously she had been wasting all her money on emotions. She understood perfectly well that she needed to consciously stop. She wanted to take care of her wallet. She looked at her father with a smile and said that she washed the floors, cleaned the toilets, ironed the clothes that the Viscount's maids entrusted to her, even took out the trash. She said with a satisfied smile that her work should be paid. For a moment, everyone froze in shock, not knowing what to answer. A moment later, the Duke began to list everything she had just told him. The Duke's assistant winced as the Duke was beside himself with anger. The Duke stood frozen in place with rage in his eyes. He was very angry that his only daughter was a servant. The Duke looked closely at his assistant and called him Agasadi. Trembling with fear, told the master that he was listening to him. The Duke asked his aide how much wealth the Ilian family had. The aide said that first of all, it was the granary in the south, which connected the Marquisate the Heartlands and the Free Country, which had a guild of dual slave ports. The Duke looked at his daughter and asked if that was enough. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked at her intently and asked if all this would pay for her work. The young lady froze in place in shock, as she did not expect such a thing. The Duke looked at his assistant and said that all the assets that previously belonged to the Viscount should be registered in the name of his daughter. Felicia Z. froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear something like that. The assistant looked closely at the young lady and said that he understood everything. The Viscount was in shock, as he understood that the guild and estate were being taken away from him. He trembled with fear and anger. That day was the last time she saw the Viscount. A month later, all the property that belonged to his family was marked with waving flags, depicting a black panther, the symbol of the Valwis family, which was a veiled message about the death of the Viscount. Ilian estate, there was a commotion, as the Viscountess was desperately looking for the slave sales ledger. She wanted someone to bring it to her immediately. She was in shock and simply could not believe that everything ended this way. She knew she should have known earlier that something had gone wrong when Viscount P disappeared for several months. She was very angry, as she had previously told the Viscount that the young lady was an aristocrat, but he unfortunately did not take her words into account. She understood perfectly well that it was stupid of him to insist on his own way. She was puzzled, as he even indulged in gambling and illegal slave trading. The Viscountess understood perfectly well that if any of these crimes were revealed, she would hardly be able to avoid the death penalty. She knew that the knights of the Duchy would soon attack them. She wanted to hurry and escape as soon as possible. The Viscountess was very angry and did not understand why her servants did not help her. She shouted and demanded that they bring the luggage faster. The Viscountess ran in a hurry and did not notice the man who was standing right in front of her. She collided with him. The man looked intently at the Viscountess and asked if he hadn't been taken away. Yet the Viscountess looked at him in bewilderment and asked what he was talking about. The man looked at the Viscountess intently and said angrily that he was talking about the document that confirmed the ownership of an Arab named Sion. He asked her again if it had been taken away. The Viscountess was taken aback, and with a trembling voice said that it seemed like no one had taken it. The man looked at her intently and said that this was very good, and he also, with the speed of lightning, snatched the document from her hands and left. She stared after him, not knowing who he really was. She breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that if he wanted to take the time bomb, she would let him do it. Sometime later, the men discussed the incident. They were not even surprised that the Viscount was executed, since they had heard that he treated the Duke's sick wife terribly. But the problem was that all the assets were transferred to a small child. Valwis are known for belonging to one of the four great families that have been through many wars. In other words, it can be said that they know very well how to deliver a crushing blow. The men were worried and did not understand how to make the right decision in this situation. The man told his colleagues that the young lady was a direct descendant, but he was puzzled that she was born outside the family. He sighed heavily and said that in the direct line, there were the young lords, Kai and Bian. He did not understand why they still chose her as the lady's top. The men were puzzled. They knew that the rumors were exaggerated, and it would be better to come to the estate and check everything in person. But in turn, they were scared and did not know who would dare to go into the Black Panther's lair of their own free will. The man sighed heavily and said that they could find out the truth at the next meeting. His companion looked at him in surprise and asked how they could do this. To their regret, they knew that the Duke had not appeared at the regular meetings for many years in a row. They knew that his appearance sounded like a fairy tale. The man in turn was furious. He did not understand why everyone was so worried about the broken family. He knew that, despite the fact that they were called a collateral branch of Bluebell, they were also one of the four great families. The man looked angrily at everyone present and said that he would go and scout out the situation. Everyone present was surprised, as they did not expect him to agree. A moment later, he grows up and says he wants to see how the Black Panthers are doing at home. The young men looked at their colleague intently, as if they were happy that they would not have to go. They discussed their actions for some time, and also said that they had great hopes for the man. The lady looked at the man closely and asked if the little thing was the direct heir of the family. Kneeling, the man looked at the lady closely and said that everything was correct. A moment later, he presented her with a document of ownership of the slave Xian. The lady looked at him intently and thanked him and told him to keep it while he had it. The man looked at her intently and said that, currently, other families believe that the reason for the Duke's chance is the young lady. The man looked at the lady intently and said that he would handle it. The lady said with a smirk that there was no need for that, as they could wait, as she wanted to see the skills of the child she had specially sent to the Duchy. Valicia looked at Agas and asked, "What about Sion?" She wanted to know how he was feeling. The assistant looked at the young lady in surprise and asked who she was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that she would now speak about the boy with blonde hair. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really talking about that slave. Agasa looked at the young lady intently and said that the boy had woken up but had not yet fully recovered. However, it was said that his treatment had been successful. The young lady looked at him in surprise and breathed a sigh of relief. Vilicia, in turn, understood perfectly well that she could not abandon her first friend. Sometime later, Lisa approached the young lady and said with a smile that she was starting, and also asked the lady if she was ready. Valicia Kay shouted to her maid that of course she was ready, and she also hurried. Her Agesa was shocked, but he expected nothing else from the young lady. A moment later, the young lady was receiving a rain of checks and banknotes. Lisa in turn threw money around the lady with a smile. The young man sighed heavily, and looking at the young lady, said that he never thought that she would throw away money like that. The young lady turned around, with a fierce, cold gaze, looked at him, and asked what he was saying. The assistant smiled gently, and told the young lady that it was very graceful of her. Vilicia, in turn, understood perfectly well that today was a historic day since the first monthly benefit in her new life had arrived. The young lady lay on the money with a smile. She knew that these banknotes constituted less than a tenth of the allowance. She was very pleased that everything was going as she wanted, since she had established a relationship with her father and with Xian. He had made a very good profit. She wanted to buy her capital late and escape. But in turn, she was a little worried and wondered if her father could survive without her. She knew that eventually he would meet the imperial family and then meet her. But in turn, she was worried and wondered if their family could continue to live together if he was not obsessed with the idea of resurrecting her mother. A moment later, she heard someone calling her. The young lady, in turn, returned to reality as she remembered that she was not alone now. She looked at those present in surprise and asked what was the matter. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile what she liked better, the plush kitten she made or the money. Valizia understood perfectly well that she of course liked money, but if she said so, Lisa would be very upset. The young lady in turn hesitated, not knowing how to answer. A moment later, she said with a smile that she liked money better. Lisa smiled, as she expected a slightly different answer. Agasa looked at the young lady with a smile on his face and asked her what she loved more, him or money. Valizia P. looked at him and immediately said that she loves money. She asked in surprise why she was asking such obvious things. The young man was surprised and upset, since she did not hesitate for a second. A moment later, the Duke approached her and asked her what she loved more, her father or money. The young lady wanted to answer with lightning speed, but hesitated a little. Turning around, she saw her father, and taken aback, asked when he had managed to arrive. The Duke looked intently at his daughter and asked whether she loved him or money more. Valizia Z froze in shock, not knowing what to answer to this question. But a moment later, she threw herself into his arms with a smile and said that of course she would choose her father. She understood perfectly well that this was exactly what he wanted to hear from her. The Duke looked at his daughter intently and said that this was the wrong answer. The young lady froze in shock, and looking at her father, she asked in what sense this was the wrong answer. Cassius looked at his daughter with a tender smile and said that she should love both money and him. Some time later, the young lady decided to hold an emergency meeting. She looked closely at everyone present and said that they had come on time. Valizia number 1 looked intently at everyone present and said that even though she had a more important position, she could not be late. Valizia number 2 sighed heavily and asked if they were not the same person, since everything was obvious to her. The young lady in turn froze in place as she felt that this was going to be a long and difficult discussion. She looked intently at everyone present and said that they needed to begin their meeting. She came to her dream after she ate cake and went to bed. She looked at everyone present and said that the topic of their meeting today was flight or Cassius. She looked at them all and said that they needed to discuss which was more important. She sighed heavily and said that she was sure they knew there was a difference of opinion on the matter. She said that now it was necessary to listen to both sides and try to make a decision to run away or save her father. Valizia number 1 looked intently at everyone present and said that she thought they needed to run. She said that they are professional supporting characters, and they should not interfere with the main characters. Valizia number 2 sighed heavily and said that she had heard this for the 100th time. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that they were back to their old ways. She was puzzled as they were constantly starting to quarrel over nothing. Valizia number 1 stood up and said that they were born for a reason. She was puzzled as she knew that something was wrong with their sudden regression. Valizia number 2 sighed heavily and said with anger that if something was wrong, then in the spirit world they would have already done something. She looked intently at Valizia number 1 and asked if she was really that stupid. She was furious and shouted that she was not stupid at all, since they had already lived many lives. They began to quarrel, but the young lady was shocked and asked them to calm down. Valizia number 1 sighed heavily and said that in any case, she was against it. The young lady in turn thought for a moment. She knew that the best outcome imaginable was for the entire family to escape the death penalty. She understood perfectly well that to do this, she would have to change the original plot. But she was still bothered by the fact that she had been a professional supporting character since birth. She sighed heavily and said that this was not even a bad option. Valizia number 1 thanked her. Valizia number 2 looked at everyone gathered and asked if this was the best they could come up with. A moment later, she said with fury that Valizia number 1 gives up easily proposing something that will not work. She said angrily that many months had passed and no punishment had followed from the spirit world. She looked closely at everyone gathered and said that they even had an assistant who brought them letters. She shouted that this chance was given to them by God. She asked them why they couldn't accept it. Valizia number 1 sighed heavily and said that it could be ordinary spam. Valizia number 2 sighed heavily and said that God never makes mistakes, and their return to the past is like a gift for all the lives they have lived. The young lady froze in shock, not knowing what to do or what to believe. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that of course that made sense. She knew that the very fact that a minor character had returned to the past was already sufficient evidence. She understood perfectly well that this was a huge chance to change the original story. But she was alarmed by the fact that lately, after everything that happened, there were no connections with the spirit world. She understood perfectly well that this meant that they had problems there. She was a little surprised and alarmed that the said divine favor was bestowed upon a professional minor character. She knew that now the only thing that could be used as a clue was the mysterious letter that the stupid bird had given her. The young lady was shocked as she understood that this was all very difficult for her. Valitia number 2 looked at her intently and said that she should think about it very carefully. She looked at her intently and asked if she could really run away at 16. The young lady looked at her in surprise and firmly said that of course she could escape. She looked at her in surprise and asked if she would really abandon her maid. Lisa Valizia looked at her and said that of course she would take the maid with her. Valizia number 2 began to list everyone with whom the young lady had become friends recently. Valizia, Z froze in place. She did not know what to answer to this question. Valizia number 2 looked at her and said that if she said goodbye to them, it would be forever. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if she could really leave them alone. Valicia froze in place, not knowing how to answer this question. She looked at Valicia intently and said that it was obvious, because if the Valwis family died, she would no longer live so happily. She looked at her intently and asked if she was sure that she could see her father die again. The young lady sighed heavily and quickly replied that she couldn't do that. Valicia said that in that case, they had to protect him, and as the daughters of a villain, they had to protect them from the villain's father. They looked closely at the young lady as they knew that she was right, and that they must certainly protect their father. Rejoicing that they had come to an agreement, they said that they would certainly protect their father. Thus the long and tense discussion ended peacefully. Valizia number 1 looked closely at everyone present and said with a smile that they should make sure that the father became the best for his daughter. She said that they should be sweet and perfect. Valitia number 2 looked at her intently and asked if she was sure that they would succeed. The young lady smiled and said that she did not know at all. Valitia number 2 sighed heavily and said that they needed to come back down to earth. She looked closely at everyone present and asked if it was time for their father to start playing his role as the villain. The young lady in turn looked intently at those present and told her that she was right. She said that by this time, the Empress who possesses divine power must have already gone to the Tundra Islands. Valitia number 2 sighed heavily and said that there their father will meet the Empress and be reborn as a real villain. Valitia sighed heavily and said that everything is exactly like that, but they must prevent him from going there. The young ladies looked at her in surprise and asked how they could do this. She looked at them intently and said that when father went to the islands, he would meet the Empress. She sighed heavily and said in all seriousness that they must prevent this at any cost. The Duke looked closely at his daughter, who was sleeping quietly, but at the same time she was mumbling and calling for her father. Agasa looked at the young lady intently and said to the Duke with a smile that it seemed like he appeared to the little lady even in her dreams. The young lady in turn was hanging around in Bosnia and said that they should end the meeting here. The Duke looked closely at his sweet little daughter, who was sleeping quietly. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that she was noisy even when she was sleeping. The knight looked at his master intently and asked if it was really okay to leave without saying goodbye. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he could not do anything as he did not want to wake the sleeping child. He sighed heavily and said that they would not see each other for about 3 weeks. The Duke froze in shock as his daughter tenderly took his hand and quietly muttered something sleepily. He leaned closer to her and heard her calling him. He looked closely at his daughter and asked if he could take her with him. The knight commander was shocked by such a statement. The Duke looked at everyone present and said that his daughter was holding his hand and he could not get out so easily. The knight looked closely at his master and said that the Suvorov Islands have a cold climate, and it is very difficult to breathe there because of the snow. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he knew this. A moment later, the Duke looked at his assistant and called him. The Duke hastily told his assistant that he planned to be away for about 3 weeks, and perhaps even longer. He looked coldly at his assistant and said that his daughter should be fine. He looked at him intently and asked if he understood. Agasa looked intently at the gentleman and said he understood everything. The next morning, the young lady woke up full of determination. The maid slowly approached the young lady and said with a smile that it seemed she had woken up. Valitia rushed towards the maid with lightning speed and a smile on her face. She hugged the maid tightly because she was glad to see her. She looked closely at Lisa and called her Lisa, told the young lady with a smile that she was listening to her. Valitia told her maid with a smile on her face that she had never irritated her. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. The young lady smiled and said that Lisa was her family, and she would certainly protect her. For a moment the maid pulled away from the young lady and asked what she was talking about. Lisa looked at the young lady closely and asked if she had just called her family. Valitia frowned for a moment, after which she said that she had. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and told her to repeat it again. Valitia looked at the maid in surprise, but still repeated that Lisa was her family. A moment later, Lisa hugged the young lady tightly as she was very touched by her words. She looked at the young lady intently and asked if her sincerity had finally reached her. Lisa asked the young lady with a smile on her face if she really acknowledged her as her maid. Valitia was shocked, as she couldn't even breathe after being hugged tightly by her maid. The young lady sighed heavily. She knew that a couple of broken ribs were much better than her death. The chef looked closely at the young lady and wished her good morning with a beaming smile on his face. The lady also greeted her maids. The maids looked at the young lady with a smile on their faces and also greeted her. Valitia was shocked because she was wondering how the main characters live. The maid looked closely at the young lady and asked with a smile on her face if she was holding flowers in her hands. The young lady smiled and said that she had picked them from the garden because she wanted to present them to her father. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if this was really a gift for the Duke. The young lady in turn froze in place at the mere sight of her father's assistant. She was shocked because she saw that he was pale and tired. The young man with a forced smile wished good morning to the young lady. She froze in shock and wondered if he had slept poorly. She looked at him closely and asked if he was tired. The young man sighed heavily and said that he was fine. But the young lady in turn understood that the bruises under his eyes said otherwise. She looked at him intently and wondered if something bad had happened. She screamed and called him Agasa, looked at Valitia in surprise, as he was a little perplexed. She came closer to him with a smile and said that she didn't know what happened, but everything would be okay. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that this was the first time a 5-year-old had given him advice. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she was first and foremost her father's direct descendant, and only then a child. Agasa smiled and thanked the little lady for her support. The young lady put the glass on the table with a smile. She was amazed as she felt very refreshed after drinking the fresh juice. She also ate a wonderful salad with tender duck. She knew that she was just having a happy morning, but she also knew that it could be even more wonderful. The young lady looked at Agus intently and asked with a smile when her father would return. He looked at the young lady intently and said that his lordship would return in 3 weeks. Valitia Z froze in shock as she did not expect to hear such a thing. She looked at the young man in surprise and told him to repeat it again. He looked at her intently and said that the Duke had urgent business in a place called the Tundra Islands, so he could do nothing and had to leave. The young lady froze in shock because she knew that all was already lost. Valitia number 1 looked at Valitia intently and said that she had to protect their father. She looked at everyone present and said that as soon as her father said that he was going to go to the islands, she would immediately stop him. The young lady in turn was simply in shock. She did not know what to do since she realized that she had failed her task, and now she simply could not do anything. After this news, the young lady could not bear it and fell unconscious to the ground. Everyone was very worried about the young lady. Valitia was furious and did not understand why father was doing this to her. Valizia was shocked as she understood that previously he had regularly taken into account where he was going, but now he had hidden very important information from her. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and asked if she had come to her senses. She looked at them in surprise and, sighing heavily, said that she seemed to have fainted. The doctor looked pitifully at the young lady and said that she seemed to have been shocked by the news of his lordship's absence and therefore lost consciousness for a moment. The doctor looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that fortunately everything was fine now, but he was still very worried about her, so he asked her to rest for a few days. The young lady in turn looked intently at the doctor and called him. She looked at him intently and said angrily that she had told him earlier, "Judge a man by his heart, not by his appearance." She looked at him intently and said that he had disappointed her greatly. The doctor froze in shock as he did not expect to hear such a thing. Agasa stared at the doctor, who was so shocked that he couldn't get up from the floor. For the first few days, she skipped meals. By the fourth day, she felt a sense of calm. She sighed heavily and knew that now she could live a little. She glanced out the window and said that she needed it. She knew that despite the fact that her father was now on the islands and she had passed out from shock, everything was fine as long as they were alive. She understood perfectly well that even if they met on the islands, as in the original story, the execution would only take place 14 years later. She understood perfectly well that all she needed to do was to have time to change everything as she wanted, but she was puzzled because she did not know how to do it. A moment later, she heard some noise. Turning around, she heard the maids talking about how she had finally started eating the cake. The maid looked closely at her friend and said that it was still difficult to tell whether the young lady had come to her senses, and they needed to watch her for a while. She looked at Lisa intently and said that she should look at the young lady and not protest. Lisa, in turn, sighed heavily and still agreed. The young lady, in turn, heard everything perfectly well, but she decided to pretend that she was deaf. She slowly ate the cake, while the maids commented on all her actions. She was shocked and wondered if this was really a secret conversation on live television. Lisa said with a smile that for moments like these, she would guard the young lady's room. She said that of course she would guard the young lady's room, not only from robbers, but also from other dangers. Felicia sighed heavily as she thought that only she was superfluous here. The maid looked at Lisa intently and asked if they should tell the young lady about this incident. Lisa looked at her friend in surprise and asked if she was really talking about the boy with blonde hair right now. The young lady was taken aback in turn as she realized who they were talking about. The maid sighed heavily and said that unfortunately there was a lot of noise. A moment later, the young lady ran out of her room and hurriedly asked everyone present what had happened to her friend. The maids were shocked and asked if she had heard everything. Valizia looked intently at her maid and called her, as she wanted to know what was going on. She looked at the maid intently and told her to take her to Shan immediately. Valizia thought for a moment as she thought about what she had said earlier, that there had been a noise recently. She did not know what the maid meant by that. Valizia understood that Lisa was drowning. Something definitely bad had happened. Valizia looked at Lisa intently and asked worriedly, "What happened to Sion?" Lisa sighed heavily and said that another maid was taking care of him. The maids looked at Valizia with surprise and excitement. Valizia looked closely at everyone present and asked how Sion was doing. The maid excitedly said that the treatment had gone well, but unfortunately, he was refusing to eat, and besides that, he didn't want to talk at all. Valizia looked at the maid intently and asked if this was true. She said that, in that case, she should go and check on him. The maid looked at the boy and asked if he wanted to try some delicious food. She smiled and asked if he wanted some fried chicken. He didn't answer. The maid frowned and asked if he wanted anything else. The young lady, in turn, froze. Looking at everything that was happening, she saw that he really was not talking at all. She wondered if this was all because he was in an unfamiliar place. The maid looked at the young man with puzzlement and said that if he did not eat or respond even with good care, he would not recover, while the other maid sighed heavily because she knew that they could not abandon him to his fate, since this was the order of the young lady. She was puzzled and did not know what to do in this situation. She sighed heavily and said that if they stopped bringing him food, then at least they would treat him. Her friend sighed heavily and said that this was so, and they would treat him. A moment later, she got stuck as she saw the young lady. Vilicia looked at the maids with bewilderment as she had been caught. She wanted to eavesdrop on their conversation quietly, but unfortunately, she failed. The maid looked into the distance in surprise and saw a young lady. She was shocked as she did not expect to see her in such a place. The young man sighed heavily and quietly whispered the young lady's name. A moment later, he shouted loudly and called her. Felicia looked intently at her friend and called him with a smile. Xian En did not take his gaze off the young lady for some time. He slowly walked closer to her and asked if it was really her. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that it was so. The young lady gave her friend a radiant smile and said that he urgently needed to eat. She smiled and said that he should sit down quickly, since a sick person should not stand. He looked at her in surprise and said that he thought she was the same slave as he was. The young lady, in turn, froze in place, not knowing what to answer to this question. He looked at her puzzledly and asked if she had been brought here too. She was taken aback and said that that was not the case. A moment later, the young man winced in pain and let out a long, drawn-out sound. The young lady was shocked. She approached the young man and asked if he was ill. She was very worried because she was worried about him. He quickly grabbed her by the shoulder and, looking straight into her eyes, told her that she needed to run. The young lady froze in shock. He looked at her intently and shouted that the owner of this mansion was very cruel. He shouted that she should run away quickly. The young lady, in turn, looked intently at her friend, not knowing what to answer, since she was the daughter of the master of the mansion. The maid quietly whispered to the young lady that it seemed the boy did not know who the young lady was. Valicia, in turn, sighed heavily and quietly said that this was exactly the case. She understood perfectly well that she did not need to hide from him, since she was the daughter of the cruel owner of the estate. She looked closely at all the maids present and asked them to leave for a minute. The young man froze in surprise, looking at his friend. He looked closely at the maids who were slowly leaving the room. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was a young lady. He froze for a moment as he had previously heard of a young lady who lived in a separate house. He looked at her in surprise and asked if this meant that she was a young lady. Felicia looked at her friend in surprise as he was very polite to her. She looked at her friend closely and said that the attack is what it is, and she asked her father about it. She looked at him in surprise and asked with a smile why he was so polite to her. She said that he could address her informally. Yen sighed heavily and apologized to the young lady. She looked at him with a smile and asked him to treat her less formally. Since they had communicated before, she felt more comfortable than now. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness. The young lady, in turn, was shocked. She was very nervous as he continued to speak to her formally. She, in turn, continued to insist that he speak to her informally. She was in shock. She did not understand why he was still so polite to her. The young lady, in turn, reached out to him, but he pulled his hand away from her with the speed of lightning. The young lady froze in place from shock, as she did not expect this. She looked at her friend intently, as she couldn't believe what was happening. She wondered if he hated her as much as she was the daughter of the cruel master. She looked at her friend intently, as she was puzzled, and did not know what to do next. The young lady slowly approached the door. For a while she hesitated to enter the room, when suddenly she heard the ladies' conversation. The girl told her friend that if she became friends with a girl like Valicia, she would be used. The girl said that she would never be friends with that mean girl, since they only had a business relationship. She asked with a smirk who would even communicate with someone like her. Valicia was shocked, as it was very unpleasant for her to hear something like that. All her time, she wanted to have loyal and reliable friends next to her. But unfortunately, everything was the opposite. Now she remembered that bad moment. It was very painful for her, because she understood that everything was happening again. The young lady looked at the door and called Lisa. The maid came to the young lady with lightning speed and said that she was listening to her. She looked closely at the maid and asked her to bring them some food, namely a fresh steak. Some time later, the maids brought everything that the young lady asked for. Felicia said to the young man with a smile that he needed to eat first before taking his medicine. Sian Opeshil, looking at the young lady, he said that he could not eat it, since he unfortunately would not be able to pay for everything. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was not hungry. He sighed heavily, and without looking at the young lady, said that he was fine. She looked at him sharply and said that she didn't want him to pay her for the food, and that he could leave as soon as he was cured. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that after all, he was not a servant in this mansion. Valizia looked at him intently and said that he could get better and only then leave. Xian Yi looked askance at the food in front of him. He hesitated and didn't know what to do. The young lady in turn smiled and said that the steak was very delicious. He sighed heavily and said that that was not the issue. Xian said excitedly that the steak was very expensive. He looked closely at the young lady and said that wheat bread would be enough for him. Felicia, in turn, understood perfectly well that wheat bread was the cheapest. She sighed heavily as she understood perfectly well that she had no other choice and would have to use this method. She looked at him intently and said that she could not eat a steak that did not want to eat a slave. She said that she specifically asked for the steak that she usually eats. She said that if you throw it away, it will be the same as throwing away 3 gold coins. Xian looked at her in surprise and puzzlement, as he didn't know it was so expensive. The young lady in turn was very happy as she understood that her plan had worked. She came closer to him, and with a sly smile said that he had no choice but to chew his food thoroughly. She said that they couldn't just throw away 3 gold coins. She said with a smile that it was very tasty. Since she saw that he was in no hurry to start eating, she looked at the young lady with embarrassment and said that, unfortunately, he didn't know how to eat it. Valizia was shocked, as she did not expect to hear something like this. He looked at her intently and said that it was okay, since he would not eat it. Felicia was in shock. She shouted that she would definitely teach him everything. A moment later, she said that the steak was to be enjoyed. She looked closely at her friend and said with a smile that he should put a piece of meat on a fork and then put it in his mouth and chew it thoroughly. Xian was taken aback by such pressure. She looked at him intently and said angrily that he must eat it all immediately. The young man turned away and sighed heavily. He said that, unfortunately, he had not noticed how he had spoken to her less formally. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that this way, on the contrary, was much better. At the same time, she fed him meat. She looked at him with a smile and said that he had to promise her something. She smiled, and looking at her friend, she said that he must promise that, from now on, he would speak to her informally when they were alone. Valicia looked at Lisa closely and asked if Xian was eating well. Lisa looked at the young lady closely and said that he had not refused to eat since the young lady left. Lisa thought for a moment and said that he had said earlier that he wanted some kind of chocolate bun. The young lady in turn froze in shock on the spot. She suddenly remembered their first meeting. Then she offered him a chocolate bun with a smile and said that she had saved it for herself, but he was lucky and she would give it to him. She was shocked, wondering if he had become addicted to the chocolate bun since she fed it to him, but she wondered if it was her fault. The young lady was worried, because she knew that he looked like he might die of hunger at the time. She knew perfectly well that she had done nothing wrong. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and said that they could stop at his room for a minute if the young lady was worried about him. Felicia sighed heavily and said that there was no need for that, as everything was fine. She really wanted to go to him and talk, but she understood that he was still confused. She understood perfectly well that he needed more time. Felicia was in shock because she couldn't believe that she began to care about other people's feelings. She thought for a moment as she remembered that his reaction last night had been very strange. She knew that people usually bowed their heads if they found out that she was from a noble family, but he acted differently. He looked at her intently. She was well aware that his expression became more cruel when he realized that she was of the Valwis family. She understood perfectly well that, of course, she could have imagined all of this, since he could simply have been traumatized by the experience of communicating with other aristocrats. A moment later, she froze, and her thoughts were interrupted as a powerful bolt of lightning struck. And at that moment, the maid reached out to her, as she wanted to console her and drive away all her sorrows and troubles. The maid hugged the young lady and asked with a smile if their dear young lady was scared. Lisa smiled and told the young lady that she seemed to be very afraid of thunder. Lisa smiled and hugged the young lady tighter and asked how she felt after hugging. She understood perfectly well that there was no reason to doubt, since just like in her past life, it began to rain and thunder rumbled. They were slowly walking back to the young lady's room when she suddenly noticed her father's assistant. She thought for a moment as everything repeated itself. The young lady looked at her maid and called her Lisa. In turn told the young lady with a smile that she was listening to her. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was time for them to get started with the plan. Lisa sighed heavily and said that she understood her. Lisa looked intently at the young lady and said that she would wait for her not at 2 o'clock in the morning, but a little earlier. Felicia looked at her maid with a smile. She knew that she shouldn't have any problems since she had her reliable assistant and protector Lisa. She understood perfectly well that everything would go as it should if she did not fall asleep. But still the young lady could not stand it and fell asleep in the middle of the task. A moment later, she pinched herself because she knew she had to get over this. She knew perfectly well that she couldn't sleep. Felicia knew that if she couldn't stop her father, then she had to stop what was happening to their family. Agasa, unfortunately, was the center of the impending disaster. A moment later, she heard the signal given to her by the maid. The young lady in turn understood perfectly well that everything had already begun. The mouse stirred, which meant that the Duke's assistant had finished his shift and was already returning to his place. The young lady quietly left the room. She looked around carefully, as she knew that there was no one there and she could go out. She was glad that it was still raining, because the sounds of the rain made it impossible to hear her footsteps. She crept quietly down the corridor, because she knew that everything was going as she wanted, and she could easily enter the office. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and said that she would be back right after shaking the paper mouse. She said that their plan might not work if the Duke's assistant caught her while she was wandering around. The young lady was amazed because Lisa turned out to be just wonderful. She knew that if everything went according to plan, she would give her some pocket money when she received her allowance. Sometime later, the young lady entered the office. She knew that she had to quickly find these papers before she was caught. She rushed with lightning speed to the place where the documents were. She knew that the documents she needed were nearby, but she didn't know where exactly. The young lady was in shock because she was lifting a large stack of documents, and it was very difficult for her. A moment later, she couldn't bear the weight of the documents and accidentally dropped them on the ground. She sighed heavily, knowing she would have to search for them like this. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as she saw in front of her a bill to stop funding the kingdom. A war over territory broke out between the kingdom and the empire. Of course, the Valwis family commanded on the battlefield. The Duke of Cassius won this war with ease. As a result, the kingdom became part of the empire, and the half-blood Prince Peter was sent to the empire as a hostage. But the connection with the empire was broken. The Valwis, who rebelled against the kingdom, stopped funding the kingdom. In the distant future, Peter would become emperor and turn his blade towards the ducal family. She knew that after this, her family would be destroyed. The young lady was puzzled, as she knew perfectly well that this should never happen. She knew she could just get rid of the paper. Agasa slowly crept up behind the young lady and said with a smile that she was caught red-handed. Felicia was shocked because she did not expect him to catch her red-handed. She screamed very loudly. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she really wanted to tear up secret documents from the family. She looked at him worriedly and called him by name. He looked closely at the young lady and said with a grin that it was him. She was in shock and understood that the end was coming for her. She asked excitedly if he could let her go. She asked furiously how he dared to kidnap the young lady of the ducal family. She was shocked and screamed, and also asked where the guards were. A moment later, Lisa entered the office, having heard the noise. She froze looking at the Duke's assistant, as she did not expect that he would catch the young lady red-handed. Agasa looked closely at the maid and said with a smile that the thief's blanket plan had worked. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Felicia froze in shock as she looked at Lisa. She didn't understand why Agasa had come into the office. Felicia looked at her maid in surprise and said that this simply could not be, since she was on her side. The maid in turn looked timidly at the young lady and began to mumble something incoherently. Agasa looked at the young lady with a smile and said that they are always on her side, but Miss Lisa is an adult, and as an adult she tries to look after their young lady well. The young lady in turn could not stand it and bit the assistant with all her anger. The young lady looked at the maid in surprise and asked if this was really her conspiracy. She said about her maid that she could not betray her like that. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and asked for forgiveness, as the Duke's assistant said that the young lady was only 5 years old. Lisa said that she served the ducal family, and she simply could not allow the young lady to destroy secret documents. The young lady looked at the maid with tears in her eyes and asked if she had really abandoned hers. Liza, with tears in her eyes, asked the young lady for forgiveness, and she ran away with the speed of lightning. Vilizia, in turn, with tears in her eyes, looked at the maid and shouted after her. The assistant looked closely at the young lady and quickly took the documents from her hands. The young lady was furious as she realized that he had taken the secret document that she intended to destroy. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he was a good guy who was protecting her family's important official documents. He smiled and asked if he deserved praise for that. The young lady, in turn, looked at the young man with fury as she was very angry. She understood perfectly well that if she were about 10 years old now, this would definitely not have happened. She sighed heavily with tears in her eyes as she realized that she was completely good for nothing. Agasa P. looked at the young lady as he saw that she was drooping with tears in her eyes. He was worried and did not understand why she was reacting like that. He slowly sat her down on the table and asked excitedly why she was crying. He looked at her closely and said that the little lady he knew did not like such pranks. He said that of course she liked to play pranks, but not to that extent. He looked at her intently and asked if there was any reason for this. The young lady, in turn, knew very well that she had many reasons. Velitia was shocked and wondered how she could tell him that the prince who was taken hostage would become emperor. She was very disappointed. She knew perfectly well that she had a lot to say to him, but unfortunately, she couldn't do it. The young man looked at her intently as he saw that she was worried, and rising from his knees, he asked if she really wanted to play with this paper. He looked closely at Velitia and said with a smile that she should wait a few minutes. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. She wondered if he really wanted to give her the papers she had dropped earlier. She looked at him in surprise, wondering if he wouldn't be angry with her. Agasa looked at the young lady and said with a smile that there were blank papers here. He asked if she wanted to play and draw together. Agasa. Looking at the young lady, he asked if she preferred to tear papers or draw on them. She looked at him intently, as she understood that he was an adult. She sighed heavily, realizing that she was also an adult, but was behaving like a child. He came closer to her and showed her the document with a smile, and also asked if she didn't like the contents of the paper. The young lady sighed heavily, as she did not like the contents at all. A moment later, she pointed to one line. He stood frozen in shock, surprised, and called out to the young lady. Agasa looked at the document in surprise and read the contents, stating that from now on, the Duke's family would be cutting back on the supply of humanitarian goods and aid to the damaged kingdom. He looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if these were the papers she didn't like. He asked if she didn't like what was written on the paper. She looked at him intently as she understood that such a reaction was completely normal for him. Velitia sighed heavily as she understood that a 5-year-old child could not understand such complex things. Agasa looked at her and asked why she wasn't answering him. She looked at the young man with surprise and confusion and asked if anything would change if she answered the question. He sighed heavily and said that this was not so, and the meetings would be held strictly according to schedule. The young lady, in turn, shouted that in that case she would tear up the paper. He looked at her intently and said that in that case, everyone would know that the direct descendant was against it. The young lady froze in place, as she did not know what to answer. He looked closely at the young lady and said that, as a direct descendant, she could join the meeting. He sighed heavily and said that in that case, someone would ask why they should continue to finance the kingdom. The young lady froze in place, looking at her father's assistant. She didn't know if he was telling the truth. She sighed heavily, as she knew that she had nothing to say in response to her assistant's words. Moreover, she acted like a child at the moment when her plan was failing. She was puzzled, because she understood that she could not do anything, because she was very small. She had been dying all this time before she became an adult. She justified her bad habits with her young age. She knew perfectly well that she was a villain, and nothing would change that. She knew that it didn't matter at all that she was a little bad. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that she was simply a terrible person. The assistant looked at her intently as he saw that she was very worried. He looked at her intently and asked if she would answer his question. The young lady in turn sighed heavily. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that it seemed like he had done something good today. The young lady was furious and asked him to calm down. He smiled and said that of course he was not criticizing the little lady's mischievous character at all. He smiled and said that most likely her family was able to achieve everything only thanks to such a character. He looked at her intently and asked if she wanted to work overtime. She looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. He smiled and said that if the little lady didn't feel like sleeping tonight, then they could have a serious talk. He looked at her closely and asked how she knew about the plan to stop funding the kingdom. She was in shock and wondered how she could tell him that she had regressed. The young lady, in turn, decided to play dumb and asked with a smile what she had found out. She wanted to pretend that she didn't know anything. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he already knew that she knew about everything. He looked at the young lady closely and said with a smirk that Lisa told him that the young lady was going to get some secret documents on the night of the thunderstorm. Agasa looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was the Empire's prophet. Valizia Z froze in shock, not knowing what to answer, but a moment later, the young lady said with a smirk that everything was exactly like that. The young man was taken aback and asked if she was a prophet who appeared once in a millennium. Felicia smiled and said that it seemed she had been caught. He looked at her intently and said that it was too late and they would talk about these confidential matters later. The young lady smiled and agreed with him. She said that in that case she would go to bed immediately. He looked at her intently and said that he could take her to her room. At the same time he called her Lady Prophet. She looked at him intently as she was surprised she knew that he was one of the talents of the family. But she wondered if he really believed in this fairy tale. She sighed heavily as she was very worried about the future of her family. The next morning, the young lady asked everyone for forgiveness. She was very ashamed of yesterday, so she went and apologized to everyone. The knights were surprised and about the task, but looked at the young lady and said that she did not need to bow her head before them. The maids looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she should not bow her head to them, but the young lady in turn still apologized. The maid looked at the knight in surprise and asked what was going on. The knight looked at the maid in bewilderment and said that the young lady had asked everyone for forgiveness for no apparent reason. She was shocked and wondered when her apology had become such big news. Agasa looked at everyone closely and said with a smile that it seemed like the young lady was thinking about what happened this morning. He smiled and said that it was rare to see such a thing. The young lady glared at the young man with fury, as she knew that this was all because of him. She was very ashamed and decided to tell everyone everything. She looked at the assistant intently and told him to stop. He looked at her in surprise. She looked at him intently and said that they could finish this quietly. A moment later, she saw her friend in the distance. Valizia thought about it, because if she continued in the same spirit, the young man's wariness would disappear. She understood that it was not very pleasant for an aristocrat to apologize to commoners. The young lady looked at the assistant sharply and said that he could continue talking about her apology. He looked at her intently and said that he would not do that. The young lady froze in shock, as she did not understand why he was acting like that. He smiled, looking at the young lady, and said that he had already seen the most interesting part, and since she had already apologized, he would go about his business. The young lady in turn was simply furious since everything was not going according to her plan. She screamed very loudly, and her friend got scared. He ran away with the speed of lightning. The young lady was shocked, taken aback. She shouted to her friend to wait. With tears in her eyes, she screamed and asked him to stop, but it was all in vain. She screamed that she was not at all the kind of noblewoman who abused her power. The young lady ran after her friend because she wanted to talk to him. She was very puzzled because he was running very fast, and she could not catch up with him. She understood perfectly well that she couldn't just forget about him, since he was her very first friend. She slowly took off her shoes since it was uncomfortable for her to run in them. A moment later, she ran towards him with lightning speed and shouted very loudly that it was just a misunderstanding, she just wanted to talk to him. The maids looked at the young lady in bewilderment, as they did not understand why she was chasing the slave. The knight looked closely at the young lady and asked if she needed them to catch the boy. She shouted that it was none of their business, and they should not interfere in such things. A moment later, the young lady was rejoicing. And as she had almost caught up with her friend, she knew that before, when she had tried to shake his hand, he had avoided her. She knew perfectly well that when it came to children, you had to be careful. A moment later, she stopped and called out to her friend, asking if he could stop. Xian froze in shock and turned around. She looked at him intently and asked if he could do it for her. She ran up to him and grabbed his hand with a smile and said she caught him. The young lady looked intently at her friend and said that she would just like to talk to him. But a moment later, her legs gave out and she fell with a crash onto her friend. She was surprised, because after the fall, she did not feel any pain at all. The young lady looked in surprise to see that she was lying on her friend. She was taken aback and asked him for forgiveness. He looked at her intently and asked if he refused. Would she give in? She looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to answer. He looked at her intently and said that she herself asked him to stop. The young lady thought for a moment and said that it was so. A moment later, she heard all the servants running to her as she had fallen. Xian looked at the young lady intently and asked if he said no, she would really stop. She looked at her friend intently and said that of course she would stop. She smiled at her friend and said she just wanted to clear up some misunderstandings. He sighed heavily and said that in that case he was wrong. The young lady looked at her friend in bewilderment. Xian sighed heavily and said that it was entirely his fault, as he was unclear in his intentions and gave vague answers. He looked at her closely and said that she had a strange expression on her face. She looked at her friend in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He looked closely at the young lady and said that everything was exactly like that. And right now, she had a strange expression on her face since it did not suit the Valwis family. The young lady in turn sighed heavily as she was very upset since her thoughts were confirmed. She understood that he simply hated her family. Looking at her friend, she wondered why he hated her family so much. She knew that her father had done nothing wrong to him. She knew perfectly well that her father was a villain, but Xian had no reason to hold a grudge against them. Felicia looked intently at her friend and said that if he had any complaints, he could tell her. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, Agasa P picked up the young lady in his arms as he finally found her. Felicia was in shock, as she did not expect him to do something like this. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that he caught her again. She looked at him in surprise as she did not understand what he was talking about. He smiled and asked if she was okay, as he was very worried that she might have gotten hurt. She sighed heavily and said that she was fine, thanks to him. She was a little confused and didn't want her friend to see her like that. Felicia said sheepishly that she was a young lady. The kids smiled and said that everyone knew that a moment later, the maids came up to them as they were very worried about the young lady. The knight looked closely at the young lady. He asked if she had fallen because of her socks. Lisa was shocked by such a statement. She ran up to the young lady with lightning speed and said that it was all because of the socks, and they had to take them off immediately. The young lady was shocked and shouted at her maid to wait a little. The servant looked closely at the maid and said that these were just socks, and the condition of the young lady was much more important. Lisa sighed heavily and said that he was right. Agasa looked at the young lady intently and said that they should go to the doctor. She sighed heavily and said with embarrassment that he could do whatever he wanted. She looked at her friend with embarrassment and said that he would also be taken there. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that she usually didn't behave like that. He looked at her in surprise but didn't answer. As she was leaving, she shouted that she would soon come to his room, so he should wait for her there. She smiled and said that they would see each other later. The young man froze in place. He did not know how to react to something like this. The young lady was furious, because finally, for the first time in a long time, her friend asked her the first question, but Agasa intervened in their conversation. She was shocked and wondered if it was really that hard to make friends with someone, but she understood perfectly well that even if she thought about it, she still wouldn't know the answer. She wondered if her friend was afraid of her, because she was a Valwis. She knew that, in that case, she shouldn't follow him around at all. Late in the evening, the young lady could not sleep and went to her maid. The maid happily treated the young mistress to wonderful tea and dessert. She looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was feeling better. Lisa smiled and said, "Young lady, that she should eat very well." Felicia thanked her maid for her concern. Lisa looked closely at the young lady who was eating desserts with gusto. She asked with a smile, "What could be better than delicious food?" The lady looked closely at her maid and asked if it was difficult to make friends with someone. Lisa looked closely at the young lady and asked what her social circle was. Lisa said with a smile that many would probably line up to befriend the young lady. She looked closely at her maid and sighed heavily and said that as far as she knew, such friendships did not last long. The maid looked at the young lady in surprise, as she did not expect to hear such a thing.